It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster as the Chancellor prepares to deliver his spring statement. How will Rishi Sunak respond to the crisis of cost of living? With me today for this Politics Live special, political editor Laura Kuenssberg, business editor Simon Jack and economics editor Faisal Islam. Today, inflation hits a 30-year high. The Chancellor promises further support to help with the cost of living. Rishi Sunak will reveal his plans in just over an hour, but his tax rises are also about to hit households.
He's doing that, he hopes, so that just before the election, he can try to cut taxes and claim to be a tax-cutting government.
The war in Ukraine continues to rage, and it's pushing up global energy and food prices yet further. Also today, we'll be live in the Commons for Prime Minister's questions.
We're here at Darlington Market speaking to local businesses who've been hit by rising costs. Join us.
So, welcome to this Politics Live special and welcome to viewers on the news channel. Today's spring statement comes against a background of extraordinary pressures on household finances and budgets. That has been driven by today's figures and will be further exacerbated by the facts that inflation is now at a record high of 6.2%. It's driven by rising fuel, energy and food prices. You may remember it was only a few months ago that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, had his budget in October. A few weeks ago, he came back and announced further emergency measures to help households deal with rising energy bills from February. That all now seems out of date. And again, the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is likely to further increase the cost of fuel in the coming months. Now, any hope that Rishi Sunak, who we can see here contemplating what he's going to do, but any hope that it was going to be quiet, this statement with few policy announcement, well, that seems to be dashed. He's under huge political pressure from all sides to intervene at quite a dramatic level to alleviate the pressure on people's finances. There are warnings that actually the cost of living crisis increasingly threatens to become a poverty emergency across the UK. We have had some words from him last night. He wanted to very much root today's statement and the problems facing the economy and millions of households in what's going on in Ukraine. But the cost of living crisis did start before that. He left, actually, for the Commons about 45 minutes ago. Here he is, coming out of the famous number 11 door. Now, of course, this is not a budget. It is a financial statement. He hasn't got his red box. He's not there with his Treasury team. But here he is, having put the finishing touches to his speech and on his way to the Commons. As I said, there is huge political pressure and lots of advice that's been given to him, like cutting fuel duty by 5 pence and also either scrapping or delaying the rise in national insurance contributions on employees and employers that is going to hit next month. Here's a flavour in some of the papers, the Daily Mail. You can spike the hike, Rishi. That is the national insurance contribution hike. And this in the Financial Times, something slightly different, which we'll talk about, which is Sunak to lay aside windfall cash rather than helping households. This is because he's said to have something in the region of £20 billion extra in terms of the public finances that he could use to help households, or, as the Financial Times says, he's going to lay aside for debt repayments. The pressure is huge, Laura, isn't it, on him? It's a moment of real peril.
It really is, and it's a moment of risk and a moment of political danger. But for Rishi Sunak, it's a moment where he very much wants to be seen to, and indeed to keep his head and keep his nerve and not give in to all of those very many demands that are being put forward by the opposition, by helpful backbench MPs, by many of the newspapers, by business groups, by, families and firms around the country, waking up to those historic inflation figures today, a real surge. This isn't something in the kind of rounding error, a few decimal points here and there. We are seeing prices rise at the fastest rate in 3 decades, and that is a massive political problem, as well as a phenomenon of economics. But, you know, Rishi Sunak is not, in terms of setting expectation at all in the market for a big bang bazooka day of giving billions and billions to people. Several different reasons for that. One, because there's a moment of wait and see. The Treasury knows it's going to be bad, but they're not quite sure how bad.
Or for how long.
Or for how long. But also there's a political calculation here. There's Rishi Sunak's political instincts. He wants to be somebody who's seen to care about balancing the books, a small state kind of person. But there is also the political imperative that he and Boris Johnson want to be able to cut taxes going into the next election. And that's really the political argument that's going backwards and forwards here that ministers are grappling with. Hold your fire now, be able to have a feel-good factor in 24. But the question is the political risk of maybe saying to people, suggesting to the public that the government doesn't really get how tough things might be. That's a big risk to run.
And it is the big judgment, the political judgment is how far does he intervene?
Absolutely.
I mean, he's used terms like standing by people. We'll see exactly what that looks like when he stands up shortly. Let's just show people, because it is stark, Faisal. This is the inflation rate. You can see it very clearly here. Consumer Prices Index at 0.4% February, March last year. It's now at 6.2%. What is driving it?
Well, I think it's worth putting some context on that number. It's treble what the Bank of England is supposed to target.
2%.
You know, we used to make headlines out of it being 3 or 4%, and it's not going to stop at 6% because, you know, we're going to hear a lot of blaming of the economic situation going forward on the invasion. But remember, this covers only 3 or 4 days of the invasion. You know, that's February's data, and it's driven by the bounce back from the pandemic. So you have essentially a situation where the demand in the economy bounced back really quickly, but the cogs and wheels of the global economy, where power stations or factories didn't quite get going quickly enough to get inflation in that situation, other supply chain problems, and that has contributed to this pressure, and in particular in energy. So energy prices have gone up. It doesn't include the massive rise in energy that we're going to get next month in energy prices, average £700 for a
And then they could go up again, of course.
And then they could go up again
in October.
You know, it's sort of a few £100 minimum, okay, per year. That is, I should say. So these are very difficult sets of stats. It's not the end of the story, and what you hear from the Treasury, what you had heard from the Treasury, is a whole set of difficult decisions that crystallise immediately from that number. So next month, for example, benefits, universal credit, all that stuff is going up by 3.1%, exactly half. State pension, 3.1%, because that's exactly half. And then you have the flip side of that, which is in October, November, because we still think inflation is going to be high, perhaps higher.
Some people are saying 8 to 10%.
8 to 10%, and that's, well, some people is the Bank of England indicating in that.
Yes,
now, we will get it's also other people too, but it's the Bank of England their forecast. But you've also got so we'll have a forecast in the Office of Budget Responsibility. Now it's going to be very difficult now. Imagine you're in the Treasury and you're talking to the public sector workers and you're saying, "Oh, this was just a one-off, freakish thing. You'll all go back to normal very quickly indeed." Well, that is not the forecast now. It's going to stay at this level till the end of the year. Difficult to resist demands for, you know, some extra generosity above, say, the inflation target of 2%.
Well, and the reason there is pressure for greater generosity, as you put it, is perhaps these figures here, and also better than expected tax receipts. These are monthly borrowing figures. All right, you look at April last year, just over 24 billion. They've gone down February this year to 13 billion. That is what they call this headroom, this sort of wriggle room for the Chancellor. The question is, what does he do with that money? The pressure is for him to use it to help households, or, as we saw there in the headline in the Financial Times, is he holding on to it to pay for higher debt repayments?
So it isn't like a war chest, it isn't a bounty. No. It's just the fact that he's borrowing less than he expected. Yeah. It doesn't automatically flow through that you therefore need to spend it. But if there are things you can spend on, you know, he has options. Now, I think our instincts are, as Laura was saying, that he's going to choose to keep a lot of that back. Why? Because they want to keep some of their powder dry. You mentioned the issue of the extra rise in energy prices, okay, for example. Now, that could be worth 10, 15 billion pounds in terms of extra rises. They're going to keep something back if that turns out to be as bad as it possibly could. But the flip side of all of this is what it isn't. And it isn't what we had 2 years ago. It isn't a whatever it takes moment. And there are reasons for that. One of the principal reasons is the fear that these rising energy prices are not a one-off thing, that they will last for 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Well, and that makes
couldn't possibly afford them.
Well, and that makes it very difficult, particularly when you put it in context. Simon, I'm going to come to you on the back of what's happening in April. It is a crunch month for households. You've alluded to it, Faisal. We've got the energy price cap rises to almost £2,000. The cap lifted by about £700 a year. And as we said, it could go up even further later on. Then we've got increases in national insurance contributions, hugely controversial. Lots of Conservative MPs saying it should be postponed, perhaps even scrapped, and changes to income tax. This is the freeze on both the income tax-free allowance and the point at which people start paying the higher rate. The real terms cut to welfare payments, as you were saying, the Chancellor had announced a 3.1% increase in benefits, but inflation obviously dwarfs that increase, and it will obviously be a real terms cut. These are the measures that the Chancellor had already announced to help people with energy bills: a council tax rebate of £150 for bands, households A to D, and there's also going to be a rebate loan on energy bills of £200 for every household in the autumn. You, of course, have to pay that back. Then national living wage rises to £9.50 an hour. Simon, the increase in the national living wage will help out some workers. But what about businesses?
Well, it's an additional cost to businesses, of course, and businesses want to pay their employees well, but can they afford it, given the fact that even if we get a tweak to the threshold at which employees start paying this higher national insurance, we don't expect that to be applied to businesses, so they are going to get what they call a tax on jobs. And I think the first bullet point you raised there about the energy price cap rises to around £2,000 for individuals. I can't stress this enough. Businesses are not protected by an energy price cap. And that gets into every steel bar you forge, every rivet, every chip you fry, every bit of fertiliser you need for food. What I'm saying is that it's an incredibly pervasive inflationary pressure, and it's horrendous for some businesses, and it's coming from all sides, from Labour on energy. So they are, and what they fear is the Chancellor's going to look at GDP, it was pretty good last month. They look at corporate deposits, they're actually OK. They look at the unemployment rate, and actually, do you know what? The economy's doing OK. The corporate sector looks like I can park this for a bit and come back in October, and that's what they fear. They know they're going to get a lot on investment in skills and innovation and some of the stuff that the Chancellor laid out in this important lecture he gave. But what they're worried is that business confidence is beginning to flag right now. If you wait till October, it's much easier to sustain business confidence now than it is to try and get it back when you've lost it by October. And that's the gamble I think the Chancellor might be taking.
Well, let's get more of a feel for that, because we can talk to Fiona Trott. My colleague is in the northeast of England at a market in Darlington. Hello to you, Fiona. What are people there looking for from Rishi Sunak today?
Hello, hello to you as well. Well, over the past 150 years, this market has seen the economy rise and fall, the best of times, the worst of times. Today, people here telling us they're tightening their belts. It's not just them, it's businesses too who are trying to manage those increased costs. We're going to chat to Robin, who runs a fruit and veg stall here, and Diane, you own a local haulage firm. Robin, first of all, just give us an idea of the increase in costs that you're facing at the moment.
Well, there's a small increase at the moment, but I mean, this is going to escalate. And I mean, but we're trying to keep these costs down to as low as we possibly can.
It's not just fuel, which we both have in common. You're looking for a fuel duty cut today, but you grow vegetables as well, Robin. It's the cost of fertilisers, this kind of thing.
We do, yes. Everything's included in this. And I mean, the thing is, yes, fuel is a big thing, but also as well. But it's all fuel related, really. And it would help, to get this brought down a bit, the fuel duty.
Are you passing this on to the customer?
Some of it, but we're trying to keep our prices as competitive as possible.
What do they say to you when customers come in? They're really feeling the pinch, are they?
Yes, and I think some people, everybody's got it on the mind. And it isn't just it's across the board. That's the trouble, you see. It isn't just one item or two items. It's across the board. It's affecting everything.
You've been here for over 70 years. You don't look that old. You told me you did. Have you ever known it this bad?
No, I think this is the worst thing I've seen while I've been in business over man and boy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Diane, tell us also about the rise in diesel. How's that affected your business?
Diesel. Well, since January, it's gone up a third, basically. Each week, the fuel people send us a cost, and each week it usually goes up. It's been going up maybe 2-5 pence a week, but the week before last, it went up 14.38 pence in 1 week, and you just think, oh, how do you manage this, basically? So unfortunately,
how do you? What are you doing?
We decided as a family, because we are a family-based company, that we needed to put a fuel surcharge on each invoice as a separate line, not as a cost for a job completed, as a separate line at the bottom. Luckily for us, most of our customers understood. A few didn't, and a few said, can't you just add it to the job, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, no, because then we're pricing ourselves out of the market.
And they're happy with that, are they?
They are. I don't think anybody was happy with it, but yes.
You're facing national insurance contribution increases as well, national living wage.
Yes.
How are you going to manage that?
Well, that's just an extra cost you've got to live with as far as we can. I don't know how else we can put our cost up without pricing ourselves out the market. And P&O hasn't helped because we do a lot of European work. We would maybe use 5-6 P&O ferries a week. We're now we maybe get one, because it's a very, very, well, it's a sad affair, the P&O. But we've gone on the Stena line, there's DFDS, and I've got very competent staff in the office that...
You're juggling things, really, in stressful times.
With them, so we are managing.
There's a question I want to ask both of you as well, because of course the Chancellor has to set out where he is, having to spend money. NHS, social care, defence, perhaps, especially because you're facing an increase in national insurance contributions. Are you willing to grit your teeth? And where would you like to see that money go yourselves? Where would you like to see that money spent?
Well, I think the majority of it will go to the NHS, but I would say, with the way the world is at the moment, it's going to have to go to defence, surely, because they must be doing something about the Ukraine. So I would have
That's where you want the money to be spent?
That's where I'd like the money to be spent, yes, yeah.
How about you, Robin?
I think fuel duty is important, because across the board it touches everything. But also I think as well defence should be looked at. It's important that we keep us safe.
Thank you both very much for joining us here this morning. So, of course, the statement due in about an hour's time, and here in Darlington, where part of the Treasury will be based in a couple of years. People are going to be watching that statement very closely. Yes, that's a very good point, Fiona. Thank you very much to you and to your guest there in Darlington. Interesting, actually, Faisal, that they mentioned defence spending. Obviously, the Foreign Secretary has been very keen on defence spending going up. But if we just stick with food prices for the moment, because never known it this bad, having to pass on the increases in prices to consumers, which is understandable. But that has been further exacerbated by the war in Ukraine too, because, of course, it's one of the world's largest grain exporters. Absolutely. And it's worth saying people were looking for what was happening with food prices sort of since the summer, and it wasn't really registering as having gone up across the piece. But it is now. It is now. And I just think it's worth just, I've been in various markets over the past couple of days. It's really quite interesting just how willing people are to talk about how tough things are in terms of just the array of prices that are going up. I mean, I've been reporting on economics for 20 years, and, we Brits, we don't like to talk about these things, our personal finances. But people want to. I think people are, possibly because they feel that it's an external shock that has hit everybody, not equally, but it's hit everybody similarly. Everyone can see what's going on, whatever things that they buy. And certainly on food prices, it is now coming through in the numbers. We saw some food availability issues last year, but actually the prices are coming through quite significantly. And then that's before the Russia-Ukraine shock. They're hugely important, not just in terms of wheat, but also in terms of fertiliser, which is a cost that then goes into all of food prices, or record fertiliser prices we've seen, wheat prices. Now, we don't get much of our wheat directly into the UK,
but this is a serious issue now for developing countries, for the Middle East. You know, remember when food prices were this high across the world before, we had the Arab Spring. You know, this is what we've got a series of price rises on every single major staple that is highly significant, affecting the whole world at the same time.
Yeah, I was at a potato farmer a couple of weeks ago and saying the rise in fertiliser prices. Fertiliser had tripled, which meant he wasn't going to sow 2 entire fields of potatoes. So I don't think you can underestimate
Which will push up potato prices.
And also, and of course, gas, you know, the manufacture of fertiliser is incredibly affected by the gas price. We know what's happened to that. So everywhere you look, you're seeing these inflationary pressures.
But the Chancellor can't completely lay everything at the door of the invasion into Ukraine.
No, absolutely not, because the squeeze on people's pockets was coming long before the Russian invasion. There is no doubt whatsoever it has exacerbated that trend, absolutely no question about that. But this issue has been looming for a long time. And it's interesting, actually, in government, there were people who were prepared to engage in discussion around it for quite some time. And there were people who wanted to either stick their fingers in their ears or maintain that actually it wouldn't be a problem. And it's one of the things, actually, that there was division between number 10 and number 11 on. If you look back through the archives, actually, and sort of at the very end of 2020, the Chancellor was at that point sort of putting a flag up and saying, look, when we get out of this, inflation might be a thing. You've had a period of huge borrowing, huge spending to get through the pandemic, quite understandably, many people would say. But he could have flagged the possible problem with inflation. But even this autumn, his critics would happily point out that the Prime Minister at that point was sort of saying, look, there's going to be creaks and groans as we get through the pandemic, but I'm not really worried about inflation coming.
Well,
spin on 6 months, we're in this situation where it's so acute. And don't forget, for politicians, runaway inflation is a nightmare. Whatever stripe, whatever kind of government it is a huge sort of beast that's very difficult for them to tame.
And I was going to say, and difficult to control. And that shock, of course, the most recent one, the war in Ukraine, rages on. We've been speaking on Politics Live over the last couple of days, particularly about the devastation in cities, the port city of Mariupol, for example. Actually, yesterday, a report from my colleague Andrew Harding, we can show you some of the pictures from the town of Voznesensk, which is where actually Ukrainians have had some success in pushing back Russians when they were rolling the tanks into the town. But overall, of course, it could be the case that this war rages on for weeks and months to come, and we continue to feel the consequences of that in terms of cost of living here. Let's welcome the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, because there's also, James, a diplomatic push in the next couple of days. Tell us.
Yeah, there's a big meeting in Brussels. NATO leaders, G7 leaders, EU leaders, President Biden will be there. And essentially it is to address that exact point, which is how do they sustain what they've already done? How do they maintain that unity? What do they do about sanctions, not just introducing new sanctions, but also talking about enforcing existing ones? How can they maintain the pressure on Russia at the same time as maintaining the military support, which we know Ukraine desperately needs? They're running out of munitions at the moment. How can they do that? So there's a lot for them to discuss, and it's essentially dealing with that problem is, you know, with 3.5 weeks in, how do we sustain that without reaching sort of Western fatigue?
Right, and in terms of Western fatigue, are we seeing some fracturing amongst European countries in terms of how much further they're prepared to go with sanctions on Russia, particularly when it comes to the issue of Russian oil?
Yeah, there are definite divisions. There have been divisions all along about this. Up until now, there's been a sort of an understanding. The Americans said, look, you know, we understand that we're not dependent on Russian gas. You guys are. We understand you need to cut your cloth accordingly. But there is now open divisions between some parts of Europe, you know, Northern Europe, the Baltics and others, are saying, look, we have to simply look not just, at targeting oligarchs. We need to target particularly oil. Specifically is where the focus is now. But, you know, the Germans are very explicit, saying, look, we cannot simply turn this off because of the economic impact and political impact and social impact that they will have in Germany at the time. So there is a division, but we're reaching a point where people are saying, no, actually, you know, the West has to pay an economic cost. And that ultimately is not just them, but also us as well.
Right, well, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's about the cost here that are people prepared for if it does go on for weeks, for months.
And
of attrition.
The point is it could, even if the conflict itself, which everybody at the moment, the sort of consensus is that this sort of stasis will continue of Russian bombardment and Ukrainian resistance is the most likely medium to short-term continuation. But the point is, even if that diminishes over time and there is some kind of political settlement, there will continue to be a view which says Russia needs to be taken restricted economically, and we, the West, should pay a price for that. The question is, how much a price are we prepared to pay in the long run?
Well, let's have a discussion about energy security, because, of course, that's something that the government and Boris Johnson has been talking about, trying to bring allies on. We're expecting an announcement, of course, a sort of a broad announcement on that. It's been slightly delayed. But, Laura, perhaps you'd also take us through this particular story, because there was a cabinet meeting as well. I think we can show you on the BBC News, the BBC News website, cabinet split over changing planning law to allow more wind farms. But energy security could take time.
It could take time, not just because building any kind of new energy facilities obviously takes a very, very long time. Also, it takes a very long time because successive governments, I think many people would agree, have not grasped the nettle in lots of ways. I mean, how many times have you and I discussed new nuclear and all the different controversies around that? This specific story, though, is about relaxing the rules on onshore wind. Now, we know that the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, who with Downing Street is charged with coming up with a new energy strategy, he wants to say, look, we have to look at everything, basically, and that should include wind farms, potentially in beautiful parts of the country that used to drive the Tory shires absolutely mad. The Conservatives had definitely sort of had this kind of on pause, focusing instead on offshore wind, so putting huge turbines in the sea. But Kwasi Kwarteng wants that back on the table for discussion. But as one of my colleagues, Ione Wells, discovered, there is a split in the Cabinet about that. And some Cabinet ministers, and I can assure you many Conservatives, would be deeply unhappy about the idea of looking again at putting turbines on land in the UK. The point, though, that the Business Secretary's team would make, and some in Downing Street would make, is that given everything that we've been talking about, now you have to look at all of the options. For lots of Conservatives, that also includes bringing back a proper look at fracking.
I was going to say, because fracking was sort of ruled out, wasn't it?
But I think wherever they actually end up, whatever ends up on black and white in this energy strategy, which we expect now next week, they don't have overnight solutions, either here or for the rest of Europe, as James was saying. And that's why this debate is so difficult.
Well, you saw Shell changing its mind about whether it was going to get rid of its stake in an oil field off Shetland, because they can see very clearly that they took this decision to pull out of it after COP26, the big climate summit at the end of last year. What a different world we're living in right now. They think that the political environment, the regulatory environment's going to change. We can hear, I'm sure we'll hear next week about making the most of domestic oil and gas resources, taking some big bets on new nuclear, both big and small. Bigger bets, I think, than the Treasury feel comfortable with, which is why it's been delayed. But there will be, I think he'll sort of allude to that and saying that we need to get some energy independence, because you're right, no sanction worth its salt with any bite can fail to have blowback on the countries that impose it.
On the economy and the business. In terms of net zero, I mean, there is this now growing political tension, I don't want to overstate it, in terms of what should the transition look like to net zero? Should we continue for longer with fossil fuels, the sort of exploration that we've just been talking about, or can we continue a pace for renewable energy when we've got this crisis ongoing in Ukraine?
It's always worth taking a step back sometimes. And we could have had exactly the same conversation about 15 years ago. And it is an utter failure of public policy that this hasn't been dealt with, really. That a dependence on unstable non-democracies for our energy, on top of difficulties around climate change. The obvious solution is obviously better insulation and better energy efficiency. We have terribly inefficient housing stock, for example. Just progress on this is so glacial. And you could make a difference over 15 years. Hasn't really been much of a difference made. But the honest answer right now is someone has to pay. And so we are all going to pay in terms of bills because of the lack of the access of Europe to Russian energy. But some people politically might have to pay in terms of their attitude to large structures in beautiful places. Because the reality is, after these bills start hitting people's email accounts and their doormats, which is going to be from this week onwards, is I think a lot of people are going to be asking why, especially for renewable energy, which is actually quite cheap now, they're wondering why their bills aren't cheaper. And the really interesting thing is in terms of sort of economic attack on Russia, is that they have gained the money back. So they sanctioned the central bank, which was an extraordinary act, which disarmed their war chest of hundreds of billions of dollars.
It was seen as hugely dramatic.
Hugely dramatic.
Yeah.
And they've started to fill that back up with oil and gas money. And that is the issue. So if you want to pressurise the Russians, you do have to do something on energy. And frankly, even us with oil, right, we've said we're going to wait a year because the fact is we import about a third of our diesel from Russia. So a third of our imports are from Russia, I should say.
Right.
Which is slightly different. It's about 20% of what we use. So the question is, what can we tolerate in terms of higher prices by switching off the flow of cash going to Moscow, going to the Kremlin, funding the war?
And these are the decisions going to be made over the next few days and weeks.
I would be very surprised if they make final decisions on this in the next few days. But this is the issue that they're going to have to talk about long term now, as well as dealing with the short term issue about making sure there are enough anti-tank weapons going into Ukraine, things like dealing with the humanitarian crisis. They are certainly thinking now about how long term they deal with these kind of issues. And the simple fact now that as we've been discussing, energy and the global economics is now bound up with security in a way that it hasn't been. At least viewed for a long time now. And so these debates that we're seeing, I mean, within the government, the divisions over defence spending that are coming down the tracks, the Chancellor making it very clear at the weekend that he's cautious, but the Foreign Secretary in speeches in the United States saying, what about 5%? That was our spending on defence during the Cold War. So those kind of debates too now are where we're at long term, because all of these issues are tied together in the way that they've in the past been seen as slightly separate.
Thank you very much, James Landale, for being with us. We're going to actually return to the heart of Parliament, I think, because we can talk to the Labour MP and member of the Treasury Select Committee, Dame Angela Eagle, and Conservative MP and former Justice Secretary Sir Robert Buckland. There they are. Welcome to both of you before PMQs and the statement. Robert, let's talk about the windfall tax that Labour have been proposing for some time. The windfall tax on the profits of energy companies to help out consumers in this cost of living crisis. Would you support the government doing that?
No, I think it's a mistaken approach. I think actually it will lead to higher costs being transferred inevitably onto consumers. We need an industry that invests in research and development, just the sort of transition and transformation that you've just been talking about. And I think that type of heavy-handed approach just will not work.
Heavy-handed approach, Angela?
Well, no, I think if we look, the oil and gas industry are making vast unearned profits at the moment because of the volatility and the huge increases in oil prices. Their costs haven't increased. They could carry on investing. They're actually spending all their spare money on share buybacks because they don't know what to do with it. So a one-off windfall tax to help households and individuals through this huge cost of living squeeze is exactly the right policy, and I'm a bit disappointed that Robert doesn't agree with me.
Only a bit disappointed, but actually,
I have certain expectations.
Certain expectations. Oh well, you're not meeting them, Robert. Angela, though, you do admit that the vast majority of Labour's plan, I think it's £600 you'd like to give households, wouldn't actually be funded by the windfall tax, but by the extra money that we were talking about earlier on the programme that's emerged through better than expected tax receipts. Is it really wise to be spending that when growth is pretty sluggish and we don't know exactly how much there could be available?
Well, yes, it is, because households are going to have a really, really tough time in the next year or so with this cost of living squeeze, made worse by the Chancellor's astonishing decision to increase national insurance contributions and have tax rates go up just when the squeeze is at its greatest. So yes, it's really important that we help households who are on very fixed pay rates through this very, very difficult time. Inflation 6.2% today, up from 5.5%. RPI inflation, which takes account of people's housing costs and really affects people, up at 8.2% and likely to go higher. So if we're going to help people through this very, very difficult time, the time to help them is now.
Right, well, I mean, Robert, Angela's just set it out again. We can't overemphasise that inflation rate and prices going up. Why is now the right time to introduce taxes and raise them even?
Look, I think the government has very little room for manoeuvre. It was right to make a decision to seek to fund not just the clearance of backlogs in our NHS, but also to try and fix the social care crisis. And that's why the brave and principled decision was made last September when I was still in Cabinet to do this. I think.
But is it still the right time to do it?
Look, a responsible Chancellor has to acknowledge that there are times when taxes go up as well as down. That is part of what being a fiscal conservative is all about. I think that there is work that can be done, for example, on thresholds on NI, which I've called for today. But it's to suggest somehow that we're coming to this fresh with a blank page is wrong. You know, there's £20 billion of government resources going in to help hard-pressed consumers and bill payers. We've already seen. No, but Angela, we've already
drowned out, Robert, by the increases in inflation and the fall in real wages. So the real value of people's wages because of inflation is actually going down, not up. And so now is the time to say circumstances have changed. I've got the timing of this tax increase wrong. We'll leave it until later and take it out of the equation. Give people some relief.
You see, I think that would be the wrong signal to send, I'm afraid. I think there's more direct action we can take, for example, on fuel duty. And I do think that as we see household energy prices go up, the market is just not working. When Martin Lewis tells us that he hasn't got any more tools in his money advisor cupboard, then I think the time for action is absolutely pressing.
Britain needs a pay rise.
But, you know,
Britain needs a pay rise, Robert, and the national insurance contribution increase is a pay cut.
Angela, this is a Chancellor who did whatever it took to save the economy during COVID. He put billions of pounds of public money into saving jobs. We saved millions of jobs and livelihoods. I'm absolutely confident he's the sort of guy that will stand and deliver and actually get direct
was taken
benefit.
Fraudulently, which is the amount that the national insurance contribution increase will raise.
400 billion put into the economy to save jobs. You know, let's actually mark and note that this is a Chancellor who will do what it takes to look after people's livelihoods. I have great confidence.
He hasn't said he'll do what it takes, so those haven't been the words he's used this time. He says he will stand by families and hard-pressed households. But Angela, one question, I'll come back to you on that, Robert. Yeah, well, we'll see, of course, what he actually says when he stands up. But Angela, people may be asking, that money from the tax increase in national insurance contributions is going to pay for the NHS, to recover from the pandemic, to a frontline service that people love and treasure in this country, to pay for the backlog. Are you saying you'd take that money away, or would you find another way to raise it for the NHS?
Well, partially what we were saying is the better use of public money, so the 12 billion that was wasted in fraud, which the government doesn't seem to be interested in getting back, could have been used.
Yeah, sure.
That's the same amount of money that the national insurance contribution increase will actually raise.
Right, so what would you do to raise the money, though, Angela?
By increasing national insurance contributions at this stage, that's putting more costs on employers and on employees at the time when they're the most squeezed.
You've made that clear, but what I want to know is how you would pay for the backlog in the NHS and that pandemic recovery.
What you've got to do is grow the economy properly. What you've got to do is make sure that every pound of public money is properly spent, not wasted in fraud, which is what we've seen with this government, which seems to have no interest in getting any of that money back.
Right, well, that's going to take some time. So if it was your decision, and it is, what, £12 billion a year in terms of pandemic recovery, then into the health and social care levy, how would you raise it?
But you see, the Chancellor has got 50 billion more than he thought he'd have, because the economy has come back from Omicron slightly faster than he was predicting.
So you would spend all of that?
So no, what you've got to do is take a balanced view when you've got the books in front of you and see what you can best do without cutting off recovery. And national insurance contributions increase in corporation tax as well actually cuts growth, and it cuts the spending levels of ordinary workers, makes it less likely that jobs will be created and that people will have money in their pockets. So we just think it's the wrong tax increase.
I know that, but I'm trying to get to the bottom of how you would raise that money. Let me just turn to one other issue.
There's £50 billion of leeway in the government budget that Rishi Sunak is going to be spraying around in various places this afternoon.
So we're through the looking glass here. We've got the Labour Party supporting opposing an increase in corporation tax and then opposing an increase in funding for the NHS. That's what it sounds like, Angela, and you haven't come up with any positive proposals.
First of all, hang on. The positive proposal is a windfall tax on oil and gas profits, which are out of all proportion to costs, which will help people through this very difficult period. Take away the national insurance increase, which will help the economy grow, and then see what we can do with the extra money we make from the growth. 50 billion of headroom the Chancellor's got that he's going to be playing with in his statement this afternoon. So there are always different choices that are attached to different values.
Indeed, there
when
are.
we look at a budget.
All right, well, that is a good point to let you both go. Always a pleasure. Sir Robert Buckland, Dame Angela Eagle. Go inside for the statement. We've only got a few minutes. Actually, it's Prime Minister's questions, of course, first in 5 minutes' time. Just listening to that, it is about choices, though, isn't it? There are still political choices that can be made. It's not just about the external shocks.
That's right, and that's one thing that's always so fascinating about these big days, isn't it? You know, you can't argue with the numbers that will be published in the next hour for politicians of all stripes and the publics to see and to look at. But it is all about the political priorities and political decisions that successive governments make. And it's worth, you know, those two are, of course, going at it hammering tongs, as is their liberty to do so over what we might actually see. Just a word about what we might actually see, because we haven't really talked about that much. Very heavy expectation that there will be a cut to fuel duty. Very heavy expectation, never confirmed, but very heavy expectation. Some expectation that the Chancellor might move around the thresholds at which people start paying national insurance. So it would be a very big deal if he was to get rid of that tax rise. I don't think that's going to happen, but he may well take more people out of paying it. So if you earn less, you are less likely to have to pay more NI. There is a bit of what might be a wild rumour, but who knows, about a potential cut in income tax of 1 penny. That's been doing some Westminster whispers in the last half hour.
Well, you've done my job for me here, because we've got all these possible measures coming up. I'm just going, as you're talking, I'm just going to show these, because here they are. Fuel duty cut by 5 pence, just as Laura's been saying, per litre, although people are saying it should be 15 pence if it's actually going to make a difference. The changes, as you quite rightly outlined, to the national insurance threshold. Robert Buckland mentioned them. Didn't even if it's scrapping national insurance contributions, you could rise it so people, not so many people, get caught up in it. Income tax cut by 1 pence. Yes, I was surprised to see this, but reporting in the Sun newspaper, rising universal credit allowances.
Yes, well, that's possible, tweaking those rates. So that's where, you know, chancellors can kind of play with the numbers of people who find themselves in any one group of having to either pay or are being allowed to keep more of their own income. Rather than changing policy overall. The income tax cut, if that happened, that would be a very, very dramatic, bold stroke, which would surprise people.
Yes.
But, you know, chancellors like to keep things under wraps.
Well, and he has kept it under wraps, because there's been a lot of speculation, but he's kept it very, very tight. So we don't know. I was just going to do the final one, Laura, here, which is VAT abolished on insulating homes, and more measures to encourage that. Of course, you were talking about retrofitting. I mean, it will take time, but that's another possible measure.
And few people would argue with that, right? Because if we've been talking about energy security is a huge problem, successive governments have not got to grips with it in the way that they should, I think people would sort of applaud that. Mostly it wouldn't be politically controversial to do so. But, you know, if Sunak was right now to go for a cut in income tax, that would be a sort of an enormous and surprising decision for him.
Well, it would be quite.
Take.
Well, it would be quite controversial.
Some numbers, so that's worth about 3 to 4 billion.
It's about 4 or 5 billion a year.
So you're talking, but the national insurance rise is up about 12 billion.
It's huge.
So it would be a way of rolling some of that back. But then you ask the question, well, hang on, I thought we needed that money for the health and social care levy. So
and we should point out, when you change that tax threshold on the NR, every penny you take out of that by sort of toggling that and just taking a bit more money out of that 12 billion tax rise, you are essentially taking out of the social care and national health service backlog budget, because that's the way it was sold in the first place.
Yeah. The other thing that might be perhaps a less interesting rabbit out of the hat, but the Treasury might find it very interesting, and who knows, it may be. If we were looking very carefully, the Chancellor was carrying 2 documents when he came out of number 11 today. Not just the spring statement, but also another document niftily just tucked in behind. I hear that could be some sort of standalone economic strategy or economic plan. The Chancellor's talked before about the need for sort of long-term backing the right kind of parts of the economy and encouraging investment, and that may be what that is.
Faisal, can I just get you to look at this? Well, everyone can look at the graph. Obviously, in a few minutes' time, we're going to go into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions. This is about this the sort of rhetoric of Rishi Sunak and the government saying we're a low-tax government and I'm a low-tax Chancellor. All the evidence pointing to exactly the opposite. But if we just have a look at the tax changes by the last 10 Prime Ministers, there's Boris Johnson right at the top, maybe for good reason, in terms of the interventions, 2% of GDP, and Margaret Thatcher there at the bottom. Now, it may be against Rishi Sunak's instincts, but they can't really claim that they're low tax.
They have claimed, of course, that what the difference there is that Boris Johnson endured a pandemic that cost an epic amount in the public finances, but many of the tax rises predated the pandemic, actually. So you do have the major... I mean, it's astonishing when you think about what was in the Conservative manifesto, which was almost got as far as banning tax rises, not quite. We have corporation tax going up significantly. We often forget about that. That's coming in. Yeah. You've got national insurance, and you've got the income tax freezing of the thresholds, which is our old friend fiscal drag. It just sucks in money, especially when inflation is high. But my reflection on the debate that we had with the MPs is this, which is Robert Buckland wanted to use the phrase "whatever it takes," but we don't have that "whatever it takes" moment. And if post-pandemic, we had this discussion last time, if post-pandemic the public, in particular the public that Boris Johnson managed to attract over to the Conservatives, if they've got used to having their arms put around them, to being protected from nasty shocks from outside, is this going to be enough for them?
In we go for PMQs.
Colleagues and others, in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The degrading strip search of child Q 2 years ago in a school that should have been a safe place, at the hands of police officers who she should have been able to trust, has caused anger and distress across the country. On Monday, the policing minister failed to answer 4 separate questions in this chamber, asking when he first knew about child Q and what urgent action he took in response. So I asked the Prime Minister, when did he first hear about the strip search of child Q in her school, and whether he believes that the characteristic dither and delay of his government in responding to this appalling case is remotely acceptable when it comes to the safety of children.
Mr. Speaker, I think that is a completely ridiculous characterisation of the response of the government, because of course the reports of this incident are deeply distressing and deeply concerning. Everybody shares her feelings about that, Mr. Speaker. But the Metropolitan Police have rightly apologised, and the IOPC is investigating, and for that reason, it would not be right to comment further.
Sir Oliver Hill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People across North East Hertfordshire are coming together to provide support and refuge to families fleeing the invasion in Ukraine. The Baldock and District Action Committee are about to welcome 4 families to our community. And doesn't he agree with me that this shows the open-hearted generosity of the British people? And will he continue to do all that he can with the Refugees Minister to make this process as simple and speedy as possible?
Prime Minister. I thank my honourable friend, and I also thank all those involved in the 2 big schemes that we have now for welcoming people from Ukraine. And the Homes for Ukraine scheme is now open. I think about 40,000 have already applied. 150,000 homes across this country, families across this country have said they want to welcome Ukrainians. That's a fantastic thing. I thank Baldock and District for helping to lead the way.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 800 loyal British workers fired over Zoom, instantly replaced by foreign agency workers shipped in on less than the minimum wage. If the Prime Minister can't stop that, what's the point of his government?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we condemn the callous behaviour of P&O, and I think that it is. I think that it is no way to treat hard-working employees, and I can tell him that we will not sit by, Mr. Speaker, because under Section 194 of the Trades Union and Labour Relations Act of 1992, it looks to me, Mr. Speaker, as though the company concerned has broken the law. And we will be taking action, therefore, and we will be encouraging workers themselves to take action under the 1996 Employment Rights Act. Both acts, Mr. Speaker, passed by Conservative governments. And if the company is found guilty, then they face fines running into millions of pounds, Mr. Speaker. And in addition, we will be taking steps to protect all mariners who are working in UK waters and ensure that they are all paid the living wage, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Starmer. Mr. Speaker, when Owen Paterson was on the ropes, the Prime Minister was prepared to rip up the entire rulebook to save his jobs. P&O workers want him to show the same fight in relation to them. The government had advance warning of these mass sackings. A memo was sent to the Transport Secretary and to the Prime Minister's office, but they didn't lift a finger to stop them. Did the Prime Minister not understand the memo, or did he just not bother to read it?
Prime Minister! I think what the right honourable gentleman needs to rip up, Mr. Speaker, is his pre-scripted questions. Because I've just answered the question, and the point at issue, Mr. Speaker, is whether or not the government was properly notified, and it's not about what happens the previous evening. I knew about it on the Thursday it became public, but the company concerned has a duty to notify the government 45 days, Mr. Speaker, before they take action of that kind. That is why we're taking the action that we are to protect hard-working people. And what we're also doing, by the way, Mr. Speaker, this month is lifting the living wage for all workers across our country by another £1,000. So it's up £5,000 since 2015.
Here's Starmer. I think the Prime Minister just said he knew about it on the day. Yeah. I take it from that answer the Prime Minister didn't read his WhatsApp briefing.
Surely not.
Let's test his rhetoric. Mr. Speaker, since the Prime Minister came to office, P&O have received over £38 million of government contracts. And the parent company, DP World, is lined up for £50 million of taxpayers' money under the Freeport scheme. The government is apparently reviewing these contracts, but reviews don't save jobs. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that these companies will not get a penny more of taxpayers' money or a single tax break until they reinstate the workforce?
Mr. Speaker, I think what the House has already heard is that we are taking legal action against the company concerned under the 1992 Employment and Trades Union and Labour Relations Act, and that is the right thing to do, because it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that they have broken the law. But if he's asking this government to do what Labour usually want us to do and actively pitchfork away investment around the country from overseas, Mr. Speaker, then that is not what we will do. We'll take them to court, we'll defend the rights of British workers. What we will not do, Mr. Speaker, is launch a wholehearted campaign, as they would want, against overseas investment, because that is completely wrong, and wrong for those workers, Mr. Speaker.
Well, DP World must be quaking in their boots. The Prime Minister says how disappointed he is in them, whilst handing them £50 million. Prime Minister said about the law, speaking of hollow reviews, as the law stands, it's not illegal to pay seafarers below the national minimum wage, right, even if they're working out of UK ports and in UK waters. 2 years ago, Prime Minister, his government admitted that that was unjustifiable 2 years ago, and promised 2 years ago, you've guessed it, to review it. 2 years on, despite what he says today, nothing's been done, leaving the gate wide open for P&O. British workers don't need another empty review, they need action. So when will the Prime Minister fix that gap in the law?
Mr. Speaker, with great humility, I must ask the right honourable gentleman to listen to the answer that I gave to the first question, because it would then help him to scrap his third or fourth question and try another one. We are going to address the defects in the 1998 Living Wage Act, Minimum Wage Act, and make sure that everybody serving in the UK exclusive economic zone, working in the UK exclusive economic zone, gets paid the living wage as people do in the rest of the country.
Kuenssberg. The problem is that's what he said 2 years ago. It didn't happen, and P&O took advantage of the gap left wide open by this Prime Minister. Yes. P&O's behaviour comes off the back of a string of fire and rehire cases. Profitable companies threatening to fire workers unless they accept a pay cut. The Prime Minister keeps telling us just how opposed he is to fire and rehire. But as we saw on Monday, Mr. Speaker, as we saw on Monday, he doesn't have the backbone to ban it. Whilst he sits on his hands, more and more workers are having their lives thrown upside down by this appalling practice. What good to them is a Prime Minister who's all mouth and no trousers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the most notable practitioners of fire and rehire are, of course, the Labour Party themselves. He may be interested. He may be interested to know we will be vindicating the rights of British workers, UK employees under UK law. But the law that the P&O, the company themselves, are allegedly relying on was introduced, I can tell him, as a result of EU directives. Never forget, Mr. Speaker, and he may not like it, that's the reality. He would have kept us unable to change it, unable to get out of it. He would have made it impossible for us to protect UK employees in the way that we're going to do. But what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, above all, is ensuring that workers in this country have the best protection of all, which is a job, Mr. Speaker. And under this government, thanks to the steps that we have taken, thanks to the stewardship of the economy by my right honourable friend, which you'll be hearing about in a little bit more, Mr. Speaker, we have people in payroll employment, 600,000 more of them than before the pandemic began.
He can complain all he likes, but on Monday, he ordered all of his lot to abstain on a vote to ban fire and rehire. Exactly. And they all did. And then, Mr. Speaker, to add insult to injury, after the vote, his party posted a message saying that, where possible, they will look to find P&O workers new jobs. Pathetic. They don't want new jobs. They want their old jobs back. They don't want a Prime Minister hoisting the white flag. They want him to fight for their livelihoods. 82,000 seafarers in this country. I've spoken to dockers, engineers, deckhands and sailors. They're all worried about what this means for them. This morning, one of them said to me, if P&O can get away with this, other companies will get rid of us too and replace us with cheap labour from abroad. Why does the Prime Minister think that they will take a crumb of comfort from his half-assed bluster and waffle today?
Mr. Speaker, P&O plainly aren't going to get away with it any more than any other company that treats its employees in that scandalous way, Mr. Speaker. And this is a historic moment for this country, actually, because it's now 2 years since 2 years to the day that we went into lockdown. And that plunged this country into the biggest, deepest loss of output that we've seen in our lifetimes. And thanks to the Chancellor, who protected the economy, who protected jobs, who protected companies, we've now been able to come out faster and more effectively than any other comparable economy. We have unemployment back down to 3.9%. We have 600,000 more people on the payroll, Mr. Speaker. And the best assurance we can give workers around the country is that the economy is now bigger than it was before the pandemic began. and we will continue to get the big calls right, as we got the big calls right during the pandemic. They got the big calls wrong. They would do absolutely nothing to protect workers, let alone P&O workers, Mr. Speaker, because not only would they have kept us in lockdown and kept those ships in port, Mr. Speaker, unable to move, that's the reality, kept those ships in port, but, Mr. Speaker, there has never been a Labour government that left office with unemployment lower than when they began. That is the reality, and that's their record on jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly support the government's intention to make England smoke-free by 2030, but on the current trajectory, we're going to miss that target. It is vital that we encourage or discourage young people from starting to smoke and encourage people that smoke already to give up. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's now time to raise the age of legal sale of tobacco products from 18 to 21 and impose a levy on the profits of the big tobacco companies to raise £700 million that we can put to smoking cessation services on the basis that the polluter must pay?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. He is absolutely right about smoking. It's the biggest single cause of preventable death in this country. As he'll know, Javed Khan OBE is undertaking an independent review of smoking, and I'm sure he will want to take my honourable friend's suggestions into account.
SNP spokesperson leader of the SNP in Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a matter of seconds at 12:16, an aircraft is due to depart Heathrow Airport, a Virgin Atlantic aircraft, to go to Warsaw to pick up 50 young orphans that have left Ukraine, that are coming to spend the next period of their life in Scotland with the sanctuary that we can offer them. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone that has helped to make sure that we can offer a new start to these young people away from the war, and in particular the governments in London and in Edinburgh, and in particular to thank the Immigration Minister, the member for Torbay, and the Refugee Minister in the House of Lords, Lord Harrington. This is a good day for these 50 young people, but let's hope that it's the beginning of something much more significant for many more young people that we can offer sanctuary to. Mr. Speaker, this morning we have official confirmation that inflation is at its highest level in 30 years. But families don't need official confirmation to know that the cost of food and energy are now at a price they simply can't afford. The very people who have borne the brunt of the health pandemic are now being hammered by the poverty pandemic. This is not just a cost of living crisis, this is an emergency. That is why in Scotland the SNP government is doubling the Scottish child payment and raising benefits it controls by 6%, double the rate the Chancellor has proposed for the benefits he has control over. So this is a very simple question for the Prime Minister. If he truly understands that this is an emergency, will he match the Scottish Government's commitment and lift all benefits by 6%?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much. And we all recognise the inflation, global inflation, is causing a real cost of living crisis, not just here but around the world. In the US, inflation is now running at more than 8%, we're at the levels in other European countries. We're doing everything we can to help people. The Chancellor's put another £9.1 billion into reducing the cost of energy for families. But I don't know quite what he's shouting out, Mr. Speaker, but we want to do more. And Scotland, I can tell him, is in the lead in helping this country to solve its energy problems, not just with more offshore wind, Mr. Speaker, but by abandoning the phobia of our own hydrocarbons, which I think are going to be vital for transition and avoid us being blackmailed by Putin's Russia. And on his point about the orphans, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to him for his efforts. I thank him, and it's another example, if I may say, without embarrassing him further, of the burgeoning cooperation between us.
Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, we want to make sure we open our doors in Scotland and welcome refugees, that we have that generosity of spirit, but we'll leave that there for now. Can I can I say to the Prime Minister that inflation is at 6% and increasing? We need to make sure that those the most vulnerable have that increase in benefits that they need in order to pay for fuel. And the Chancellor needs to ditch the official photographer and listen to Martin Lewis. Family finances are at breaking point. They can't tighten their budgets anymore. These families have no room for manoeuvre. But the truth is that the Chancellor does. Yep, exactly. Lower borrowing and increased taxes means that he's sitting with £28 billion to spend today. But instead, this Chancellor is making a political choice, the choice to push people further into hardship by hiking taxes, cutting universal credit and giving companies free rein to slash workers' pay through fire and rehire. So the test for the Prime Minister is this. Will the government use the full £20 billion they are sitting on to scrap the national insurance tax hike and put money into people's pockets? Or will we simply make this Tory poverty pandemic even worse?
Prime Minister.
Right, well, I just advise Mystic Meg over here that we have only, he has only 10 minutes to wait before he'll have the answer to that question, Mr. Speaker.
Ian Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome the improvements to our national Ukraine refugee response. But in the weeks since these improved measures, numbers fleeing Putin's invasion have sadly doubled to 3.5 million and are expected to go even higher. So does the Prime Minister agree our response must still move much, much faster, with a shift to processing applications in the UK, cutting the red tape and bureaucracy, so we can match the scale of Europe's worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think he's right that we are going to see many more people coming here, and he's right that the instincts of this country are to be as generous as possible, and that's why we've made sure that applications can now be processed online very quickly, Mr. Speaker, so people can come here with their passports. And under the family reunion scheme alone, I think the numbers are now running in excess of 16,000 people coming here.
Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst Ofgem can cap rising gas and electricity bills, other fuels such as heating oil, LPG and solid fuel remain unregulated. Many households in rural Scotland depend on such fuels. There are also areas awash with energy, both on and offshore, yet with huge and rising numbers in fuel poverty. Will the Prime Minister regulate and cap such fuels to alleviate hardship and end the perversity of energy-rich Scotland but fuel-poor Scots?
Well, I thank him very much, and I think he's right that energy-rich Scotland and the hydrocarbons that we have in this country should be used to help the British people, and that we shouldn't be needlessly reliant on oil and gas from Putin's Russia. And I think that's the policy of Alba, and unfortunately it's not yet the policy of the SNP.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm so proud to represent a vibrant Ukrainian community in Huddersfield and Colne Valley. And this Friday at the Ukrainian Club in Huddersfield, they'll be collecting medical supply donations to send to Ukraine and the surrounding nations. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking all of our community in West Yorkshire who have rallied round their Ukrainian neighbours and friends, and also continue to put the UK at the forefront of donations of not only humanitarian and medical supplies, but also the military aid that is allowing the Ukrainian people to fight so bravely against Putin and his cronies?
Prime Minister.
I thank you very much. I thank the Ukrainian community in Yorkshire for everything they're doing. Of course, the Ukrainian communities up and down the country, and the people of this country as a whole. I am proud that we are the biggest bilateral donor, I think, other than the United States, in aid to Ukraine. And yes, I'm also proud, as I know the whole House is, of the work that is being done continuously to give the Ukrainians the tools they need to defend themselves.
Graham Stringer.
Mr. Speaker, the Football Association are refusing to move the semi-final between Liverpool and Manchester City from Wembley. There are no trains from the northwest that day, which means 50 or 60,000 people will have to go by road. Bad for the fans, bad for the environment. Unfortunately, this is typical of the insensitivity of the FA, who think that fit and proper people to run our football clubs are Russian kleptocrats and people who are wanted for human rights abuses. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that now is the time to legislate to set up an independent regulator for football with fan involvement?
Prime Minister.
I thank you very much. I'm not going to comment on the travel arrangements for the particular match, though the deputy leader of the Labour Party shouts for me to secure her a train. I'm sure that everybody has heard the FA will have heard the message that he's given. But what I can say, Mr. Speaker, is I do agree with my honourable friend who's just conducted a review on the matter. That we should indeed have an independent regulator for football.
Helen Whateley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is a great champion for steel, and we've just had brilliant news on the removal of the US steel tariffs. Will he reaffirm the commitment he made at the dispatch box on the 31st of January that the Chancellor will bring forward a package of measures on our steel energy costs? And if the Chancellor isn't able to make good on that commitment today, will he ensure he does so as soon as he can?
Prime Minister.
I agree with her passionately, and I think that it is vital that we undo the damage done by the insane policies of the Labour government, the previous Labour government, that whacked up the cost of energy for British industry, including steel. I will be bringing forward a British energy security strategy, Mr. Speaker, that will address the needs of British steel, British ceramics, and the whole of British industry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister will share my delight that Bradford has been shortlisted to be the UK City of Culture 2025 and will want to offer his support for our bid. It would bring immense benefits and kudos to Britain's youngest city. With over 120 languages spoken across Bradford, its unique cultural heritage, diversity, and let's not forget the amazing food, the birthplace of David Hockney and the Brontes, Bradford has it all. Apart from, Mr. Speaker, government support. One practical way in which he could help is reverse the Transport Secretary's snub to Bradford in the integrated rail plan. So I ask the Prime Minister, will he look again at this and commit to delivering a real Northern powerhouse rail, including a stop in Bradford City?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I congratulate Bradford on being shortlisted in the way that that wonderful city has been, but I think she's wrong about what the integrated rail plan said, because already it's committing to cut the journey times, just from memory, from Leeds to Bradford from 20 minutes to 12 minutes, if I remember correctly. And Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to look at ways of making sure that high-speed rail goes direct to Bradford.
Alan Kern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The horrifying effects of events in Ukraine must be central to our focus, and we should do all possible to stand together in support. A war in Europe also has challenging domestic outcomes, with higher energy costs, rising food prices, and effects on supplies and inflation and across the economy in general. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this is a time where we need to come together as a nation, and anyone seeking to weaponise Putin's deliberate and calculated consequences of the war will only undermine the unity of our nation at a time when Europe is in crisis?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much for what he has said, and I think that one of the most important things that has confounded Vladimir Putin has not only been the resistance of the Ukrainians, the heroic resistance of the Ukrainians, but the unity of the rest of the world, and I must say so far, the relative unity, the important unity of this House.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been very supportive of nuclear testing veterans, so I'm sure he will be shocked that today the Mirror has uncovered 140 pages of data previously hidden in a footnote of a 1988 government report. There's now concern that the High Court and this House may have been inadvertently misinformed in 2008 when told that only 159 men in UK nuclear weapons tests were exposed to dangerous radiation, when today's data shows exposure numbers were actually 2,314. Will he urgently investigate this and arrange to meet personally in Downing Street with my constituent, her granddad and other nuclear testing veterans to bring an end to this national scandal?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member very much for bringing those facts, new facts, to the attention of the House, and I know that my office has already been in touch with the group concerned to make sure that we have a proper meeting, and I hope very much that she will be there and we'll be able to discuss all the issues that she's raised.
Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin by thanking the Government and the Home Secretary, in particular as Chair of the APPG on surrogacy, for her work to bring Ukrainian surrogates to safety here. Sadly, in my role as Chair of the APPG on anti-Semitism, the news isn't so positive. We heard from Jewish students recently who are suffering record anti-Semitic attacks on university campuses, including allegations of them being marked down by their own professors. This is completely outrageous, and you would expect the NUS to be on their side, but instead of helping those students, the NUS has been inviting somebody who is engaged in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, a rapper, to a conference. Can the Prime Minister do everything in his power to ensure campuses are a safe place for British Jewish students?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that our universities for far too long have been tolerant of casual or indeed systematic anti-Semitism, and that's why it is very important that we now have, and I hope that everybody understands the need for change and for rapid and irreversible change, but it's also important that we have an anti-Semitism task force devoted to rooting out anti-Semitism in education at all levels.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the government did nothing to stop P&O ferries sacking 800 seafarers on the spot. On the same day, the Work and Pensions Minister was forced to come to the House to announce over 1,100 DWP job losses and 42 centre closures, risking a further 7,000 jobs, including 1,300 in the North East. Working people are once again being hammered by this government in the middle of a cost of living crisis, causing genuine suffering. Why won't the Prime Minister act to protect local communities from losing real high-quality jobs?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I renew my sympathies with the case of with the P&O workers, and I've explained to the House what we're doing, and we will. But what we're also doing, Mr. Speaker, is helping the workforce up and down the country to get the coaching they need. We've doubled the number of work coaches, Mr. Speaker, and what we're seeing is employment climbing. We're seeing vacancies growing. Mr. Speaker, we are helping this country into work, and that's what Conservatives do.
Steve Bryan.
Go about their lives or even get to work because their driving licences are stuck at the DVLA. Would the Prime Minister make it clear at the dispatch box that the service from the agency falls significantly below what we expect? And would he ask the Transport Secretary to meet with me and any other member of this House? I think we may need a big room to explain how we can help them out of the hole they've put themselves in.
Absolutely. Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think, like everybody in this House, I've read some surprising things about what's been going on at the DVLA. I do think that we need to make sure that they're given every possible encouragement and support to expedite the supply of driving licences to the people of this country.
Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's nice to see the Prime Minister back. I missed him last week. A fantasy castle, perhaps Snow White too. Certainly girls, girls, girls were promised at a party. Less burlesque, more Berlusconi. According to a former minister, it seems the Prime Minister has been entertained at these bunga bunga parties hosted by his close friend, a Russian oligarch. Given his many weaknesses, could leave him open to blackmail. Why does the Prime Minister think that MI6? Why does the Prime Minister? Why does the Prime Minister think that MI6 may not entirely trust him?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I missed. Last week I wasn't here to benefit from one of his elaborately confected questions. I admire his style, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid I simply failed to detect any crouton of substance in the minestrone of nonsense that he just spoke of.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Wrexham is a town based on brewing, mining and football, a town evolving in aspiration, prosperity and creativity whilst retaining its Welsh identity. Can the Prime Minister congratulate Wrexham on being shortlisted for the City of Culture? And if he were to win, he would be the first Welsh town to do so.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Wrexham's not only the city of shortlisted for the City of Culture and with all the distinctions that she mentions, but it is also the city of vaccines, Mr. Speaker. Because without the AstraZeneca vaccines bottled in Wrexham, we wouldn't be literally wouldn't be where we are today.
Mr. Speaker, former Treasury Minister Lord Agnew has described the Chancellor's failure on COVID fraud as one of the most colossal cock-ups in recent government management, and taxpayers are paying for it. We now know the Chancellor's failure has cost the country £11.8 billion, almost exactly the same as the amount national insurance is going to be increased on working people in the coming year. Does the Prime Minister think it is fair to demand working people pay the bill for the Chancellor's failures?
Mr. Speaker, I remember him when he was doing planning at Islington Council, and a complete cock-up he made of that. What I can tell him is that this government has made sure that we got the PPE, we got the supplies that were needed in record time, and that was absolutely vital. And at a time, Mr. Speaker, when they were calling on us to go further and faster. And never forget, under the last Labour government, there was £23 billion lost in fraud every year.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the important interim report from Dr. Hilary Cass, in which she highlights the need for more research into our young girls, why so many of them are presenting with gender distress. Will my right honourable friend agree to meet with me and other concerned colleagues and to discuss how we can constructively support these young people who are experiencing gender distress?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would be very happy to meet with my honourable friend, and I think that this is one of those issues that the whole House is coming to realise is one that requires extreme sensitivity, tact, love and care. We must recognise that when people want to make a transition in their lives, that they should be treated with the maximum possible generosity and respect. And we have systems in this country that allow that and have done for a long time. We should be very proud of it. But I do want to say, in addition, Mr. Speaker, that I think when it comes to distinguishing between a man and a woman, that the basic facts of biology remain overwhelmingly important, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister met the chairman of P&O owners, DP World, to discuss setting up a free port in London. And just last year, the Foreign Secretary met DP World as well. DP World run ports in the UK which employ more than 600 workers. So if the Prime Minister wants to remove the latest suspicion of his conflicts of interest, will he tell his Dubai millionaire friends that if they want contracts to run free ports here, they must reinstate P&O workers and guarantee the jobs of DP World workers too?
Can I just say, we need to use more moderate and temperate language in this chamber. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have one overwhelming interest, and that is to protect and preserve the jobs and livelihood of the British people. And that's what we're doing. And that's what we'll do with the P&O workers, but we'll also make sure that we continue to attract overseas investment in the record ways that we currently are. They would drive it away. We won't, Mr. Speaker.
Shall I
This year marks the 50th anniversary of the expulsion of Asians from Uganda, the country where I was born. Under Ted Heath's government, people across the country opened up their homes for many of these Asians, who then settled and became part of the fabric of our great nation. That British generosity is again being seen as people open up their homes for people fleeing Ukraine as they come to our country. May I urge the Prime Minister to pick up those files from 50 years ago, wipe off the dust, and take on board those positive lessons so we can ensure that the Homes for Ukraine scheme has the maximum success.
Minister. Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I think the whole country can be proud of the way the UK welcome people fleeing Idi Amin's Uganda, and I'm sure that there are many members of the House, or several members of the House, and I know the Home Secretary herself, her family was a beneficiary of that scheme and that moment. This country is overwhelmingly generous to people fleeing in fear of their lives. We will continue to be so.
800 British workers sacked over Zoom by P&O, owned by the government of Dubai, to be replaced with foreign exploited agency workers on less than £2 an hour. The Prime Minister can pass an instrument now to close the loophole so that the national minimum wage applies on UK international routes. Is he going to stand up for British workers or the oil state dictator Dubai?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for his question, and I knew he was going to ask it, and he was right to ask it. I anticipated his question earlier on. We're going to make sure that everybody working in the UK exclusive economic zone gets paid the living wage, and Mr. Speaker, we'll do it as fast as we possibly can with their assistance.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to take legal action to hold P&O Ferries and DP World to account. And I call again on them to reverse their action and reinstate the workers. But Dover and Kent are already badly affected by this business, including on the roads and business community. Will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss specific support for our affected area, including the A2 upgrade for the National Transport links and the East Kent Enterprise Zone to cover and include the Port of Dover?
Mr. Speaker, she's right in what she says about P&O and about the 800 workers, and I will make sure that she gets all the meetings she needs to make sure that Dover, we continue with all our fantastic investments in Dover, whether transport or education or otherwise.
We're just going to give it a minute for people to leave before we start the statement. Anyone who wants to leave, please leave now. Let's clear the benches.
That brings us to the end of Prime Minister's questions there. You heard the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, just say people are going to have a moment or so to either leave or move about before, of course, the major event of the day, which is the spring statement by Rishi Sunak. Of course, not a budget. He didn't want it to be quite an all-singing, all-dancing affair, but it certainly generated huge amounts of interest. The response from Labour will come from Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor. They'll be focusing particularly on the national insurance hike coming along next month, 1.25 percentage point rise for both employees and employers. It was interesting during Prime Minister's questions. Rishi Sunak looking a little bit nervous, I thought, a little bit uncomfortable. Of course, it's not going to be an easy day for him today. Looking at the Speaker as Prime Minister's questions, pretty lengthy today. But anyway, he will be preparing to stand up for what we think is going to be about half an hour, 30 minutes. Let's go back inside.
Statements. I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, as I stand here, men, women and children are huddled in basements across Ukraine seeking protection. Soldiers and citizens alike have taken up arms to defend their land
and families. The sorrow we feel for their suffering and admiration for their bravery is only matched by the gratitude we feel for the security in which we live. And what underpins that security is the strength of our economy. It gives us the ability to fund the armed forces we need to maintain our liberty, the resources we need to support our allies, the power to impose sanctions which cause severe economic costs, and the flexibility to support businesses and individuals through crises as they emerge. But, Mr. Speaker, we should be in no doubt. Behind Putin's invasion is a dangerous calculation that democracies are divided, politically weak and economically insecure, incapable of making tough long-term decisions to strengthen our economies. Mr. Speaker, this calculation is mistaken. What the authoritarian mind perceives as division, we know are the passionate disagreements at the heart of our living, breathing democracy. What they see as chaos, we know is the freedom to be dynamic and innovative. And what they call the inherent weakness of open societies and free economies, we know is the source of our strength. We will confront this challenge to our values, not just in the arms and resources we send to Ukraine, but in strengthening our economy here at home. So when I talk about security, yes, I mean responding to the war in Ukraine, but I also mean the security of a faster growing economy, the security of more resilient public finances, and security for working families as we help with the cost of living. Mr. Speaker, today's statement builds a stronger, more secure economy for the United Kingdom. We have a moral responsibility to use our economic strength to support Ukraine and working with international partners to impose severe costs on Putin's regime. We are supplying military aid to help Ukraine defend its borders, providing around £400 million in economic and humanitarian aid, as well as up to $500 million in multilateral financial guarantees, and launching the new Homes for Ukraine scheme to make sure those forced to flee have a route to safety here in the UK. And we are imposing sanctions of unprecedented scale and scope. We've sanctioned over 1,000 individuals, entities and subsidiaries, frozen the assets of major Russian banks, imposed punitive tariffs on tea products, restricted Russia's access to sterling clearing, to insurance, to the UK's capital markets, to SWIFT, and we've targeted the Russian central bank too. Be in no doubt, these sanctions, coordinated with our allies, are working. The Russian ruble plummeted to record lows. The Moscow Stock Exchange has been largely suspended for a month, and the Central Bank of Russia has been forced to more than double interest rates to 20%. We warned that an aggressive, unprovoked invasion would be met with severe economic costs, and it has. I'm proud to say, as the whole House will say, we stand with Ukraine. But, Mr. Speaker, the actions we have taken to sanction Putin's regime are not cost-free for us at home. The invasion of Ukraine presents a risk to our recovery, as it does to countries around the world. We came into this crisis with our economy growing faster than expected, with the UK having the highest growth rate in the G7 last year. But the OBR has said specifically, there is unusually high uncertainty around the outlook. It is too early to know the full impact of the Ukraine war on the UK economy. But their initial view, combined with high global inflation and continuing supply chain pressures, means the OBR now forecasts growth this year of 3.8%. The OBR then expect the economy to grow by 1.8% in 2023 and 2.1%, 1.8% and 1.7% in the following 3 years. The House will take comfort that the lower growth outlook has not affected our strong jobs performance. Unemployment is now forecast to be lower in every year of the forecast. It is already at 3.9%, back to the low levels we saw before the pandemic. But, Mr. Speaker, the war's most significant impact domestically is on the cost of living. COVID and global factors meant goods and energy prices were already high. Statistics published this morning show that inflation in February was 6.2%, lower than the US and broadly in line with the euro area. Disruptions to global supply chains and energy markets, combined with the economic response to Putin's aggression, mean the OBR expect inflation to rise further, averaging 7.4% this year. As I said last month, the government will support the British people as they deal with the rising costs of energy. People should know that we will stand by them as we have throughout the last 2 years. That's why we've announced a £9 billion plan to help around 28 million households pay around half the April increase in the energy price cap. And people should be reassured that the energy price cap will protect their energy bills between now and the autumn. But I want to help people now, so I'm announcing 3 immediate measures. First, I'm going to help motorists. Today, I can announce, for only the second time in 20 years, fuel duty will be cut. Yeah. Not by 1, not even by 2, but by 5 pence per litre. Yeah. The biggest cut to all fuel duty rates ever. And while some have called for the cut to last until August, I have decided it will be in place until March next year, a full 12 months. Together with the freeze, it's a tax cut this year for hard-working families and businesses worth over £5 billion. And it will take effect from 6 p.m. tonight. Second, as energy costs rise, we know that energy efficiency will make a big difference to bills. But if homeowners want to install energy-saving materials, at the moment, only some items qualify for a 5% VAT relief. And there are complex rules about who is eligible. The relief used to be more generous, but from 2019, the European Court of Justice required us to restrict its eligibility. But thanks to Brexit, we're no longer constrained by EU law. So I can announce for the next 5 years, homeowners having materials like solar panels, heat pumps or insulation installed will no longer pay 5% VAT, they will pay 0. Yeah! We will also reverse the EU's decision to take wind and water turbines out of scope and zero-rate them as well. Yeah! And we will abolish all the red tape imposed on us by the EU. Yeah! A family having a solar panel set installed will see tax savings worth £1,000 and savings on their energy bill of over £300 per year. And, Mr. Speaker, this policy highlights the deficiencies in the Northern Ireland Protocol, because we won't immediately be able to apply it to Northern Ireland. But we will be raising it with the Commission as a matter of urgency. And I want to reassure members from Northern Ireland that the Executive will receive a Barnett share of the value of the relief until it can be introduced UK-wide. And the Prime Minister will bring forward further measures to reinforce our long-term energy security in the coming weeks. And finally, I want to do more to help our most vulnerable households with rising costs. They need targeted support. So I am doubling the Household Support Fund to £1 billion, with £500 million of new funding. Local authorities, Mr. Speaker, are best placed to help those in need in their local areas, and they will receive this funding from April. Mr. Speaker, we can only afford to provide this extra support because of our stronger economy and the tough but responsible decisions we've taken to rebuild our fiscal resilience. Today's forecasts confirm, even after the measures I'm announcing today, we are meeting all our fiscal rules. Underlying debt is expected to fall steadily from 83.5% of GDP in 2022-23 to 79.8% in 26-27. Borrowing as a percentage of GDP is 5.4% this year, 3.9% next year, then 1.9, 1.3, 1.2 and 1.1% in the following years. At a time when the OBR have said that our fiscal headroom could be wiped out by relatively small changes to the economic outlook, it is right that the central fiscal judgment I am making today is to meet our fiscal rules with a margin of safety. The OBR have not accounted for the full impacts of the war in Ukraine, and we should be prepared for the economy and public finances to worsen potentially significantly. And the cost of borrowing is continuing to rise. In the next financial year, we are forecast to spend £83 billion on debt interest, the highest on record, and almost 4 times the amount we spent last year. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we have already taken difficult decisions with the public finances, and that's why we will continue to weigh carefully calls for additional public spending. More borrowing is not cost or risk-free. I said it last autumn, and I say it again today. Borrowing down, debt down. Only the Conservatives can be trusted with taxpayers' money. So, Mr. Speaker, our response to the immediate crisis in Ukraine has been unwavering. But we must be equally bold in response to the deeper and more fundamental challenge Putin poses to our values. We must show the world that freedom and democracy remain the best route to peace, prosperity and happiness. We will do so by strengthening our economy here at home. To that end, we are helping families with the cost of living, creating the conditions for accelerated growth and productivity, and making sure the proceeds of growth are shared fairly. That is not the work of any one statement, but it does begin today and with one of our most important levers, the tax system. I told the House last autumn my overarching ambition was to reduce taxes by the end of this Parliament. And we will do so in a way that is responsible and sustainable. Today, I am publishing a tax plan. We will take a principled approach to cutting taxes, maintaining space against our fiscal rules, as I have done today, continuing to be disciplined with the first call on any extra resources being lower taxes, not higher spending, and of course, carefully considering the broader macroeconomic outlook. With those principles in mind, our new tax plan will build a stronger economy by reducing and reforming taxes over this Parliament in 3 ways. First, we will help families with the cost of living. Second, we will create the conditions for higher growth. And third, we will share the proceeds of growth fairly, ensuring people are left with more of their own money. Let me take each in turn. Mr. Speaker, there is now a dedicated funding source for the country's top priority, the NHS and social care, providing funding over the long term as demand grows, with every penny going straight to health and care. If it goes, then so does the funding, and that funding is needed now, especially as my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary's plans to reform healthcare will ensure every pound of taxpayers' money is well spent. When I said the Conservatives were the party of public services, the party of the NHS, I didn't just mean when it was easy, it is a total commitment. So it is right that the health and care levy stays. But a long-term funding solution for the NHS and social care is not incompatible with reducing taxes on working families. Over the last decade, it has been a Conservative mission to promote tax cuts for working people and simplify the system. That's why Conservative-led governments raised the income tax personal allowance from £6,500 in 2010 to the new level of £12,570. But the equivalent thresholds in national insurance, which define how much people can earn NICS-free, are still around £3,000 less. Now, the Prime Minister pledged in the 2019 election we would increase those thresholds. We made a big step towards that goal in my first budget in 2020, increasing the national insurance threshold to £9,500. Today, we take the next step. Our current plan is to increase the NICS threshold this year by £300. But I'm not going to do that, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to increase it by the full £3,000. Delivering our promise to fully equalise the NICS and income tax thresholds, and not incrementally over many years, but in one go this year. From this July, people will be able to earn £12,570 a year without paying a single penny of income tax or national insurance. That is a £6 billion personal tax cut for 30 million people across the United Kingdom. A tax cut for employees worth over £330 a year, the largest increase in a basic rate threshold ever, and the largest single personal tax cut in a decade. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has called it the best way to help low and middle earners through the tax system. It creates what the Centre for Policy Studies has called a universal working income. It is a tax cut that rewards work. And Mr. Speaker, around 70% of all workers will have their taxes cut by more than the amount they'll pay through the new levy. Once again showing it is this Conservative government delivering for hard-working families and helping with the cost of living. So, Mr. Speaker, the first part of our tax plan for a stronger economy is to support families with the cost of living. But as I set out in last month's May's lecture, to lift our growth and productivity, we need the private sector to train more, invest more and innovate more. People, capital, ideas. That's how we'll create a new culture of enterprise, the second part of our tax plan. The plan sets out tax-cutting options on business investment and innovation, with final decisions to be announced in the autumn budget. But these are significant and complex questions, so we will work with businesses over the summer to get the answers right. Let me explain to the House the direction of travel. First, people. We lag international peers in adult technical skills. Just 18% of 25 to 64-year-olds hold vocational qualifications, a third lower than the OECD average. And UK employers spend just half the European average on training their employees. So we will consider whether the current tax system, including the operation of the apprenticeship levy, is doing enough to incentivise businesses to invest in the right kinds of training. Second, ideas. Over the last 50 years, innovation drove around half the UK's productivity growth. But since the financial crisis, the rate of increase has slowed more than in other countries, and our lower rate of innovation explains almost all our productivity gap with the United States. Right now, we know that the amount businesses spend on R&D as a percentage of GDP is less than half the OECD average. And that is despite us spending more on tax reliefs than almost every other country. Something is not working. So we'll reform R&D tax credits so that they're effective and better value for money. We'll expand the generosity of the release to include data, cloud computing and pure maths, and we'll consider in the autumn whether to make the R&D expenditure credit more generous. Third, capital. Weak private sector investment is a long-standing cause of our productivity gap internationally. Capital investment by UK businesses is considerably lower than the OECD average of 14%, and it accounts for fully half our productivity gap with France and Germany. Once the super deduction ends next year, our overall tax treatment for capital investment will be far less generous than other advanced economies. We're going to fix that. In the autumn budget, we will cut the tax rates on business investment, and I look forward to discussing the best ways to do that with businesses. People, capital, ideas. 3 priorities for business tax cuts this autumn. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to help smaller businesses right now. So let me remind the House of our plan. Our business rates discount will take effect in April for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses. They will get a 50% discount on their business rates bill up to £110,000. A typical pub will save £5,000. That's a tax cut for hundreds of thousands of small businesses worth £1.7 billion, taking effect in just a week's time. Our Help to Grow management scheme offers businesses mini MBAs, 90% funded by government, a benefit worth several £1,000s. Help to Grow Digital gives businesses a 50% discount on buying new software, up to £5,000. We've also increased the annual investment allowance to £1 million so that small and medium-sized businesses will feel the benefit of full expensing. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to respond to the specific calls from small businesses with one further announcement today. The employment allowance cuts small businesses' tax bills, making it cheaper to employ workers. In my first budget 2 years ago, I increased that allowance. Today, I'm going further. From April, the employment allowance will increase to £5,000. That's a new tax cut worth up to £1,000 for 500,000 small businesses starting in just 2 weeks' time. So, Mr. Speaker, future tax cuts on business investment and innovation, a business rates discount worth £1.7 billion, Help to Grow schemes worth thousands of pounds per business, an annual investment allowance worth up to £1 million, and a new tax cut on the cost of employment worth £1,000 per company. Once again, Mr. Speaker, it is this Conservative government delivering for British business. Mr. Speaker, the tax plan I've announced today will help people and businesses deal with rising costs, will help raise the future growth rate of this country. But we want the proceeds of growth shared fairly, the third objective of our tax plan. The knowledge you can keep more of what you earn is a powerful incentive for people to work hard. It means greater economic security, and we know that individuals spend their money better than governments do. We've already announced today the equalisation of personal tax thresholds, giving over 30 million workers a tax cut worth over £330. And over time, I want to go further. But tax cuts must be paid for, they must be prioritised, and they must fit the economic circumstances of the time. A clear goal for Conservative chancellors, and even some Labour ones, has been to cut income tax. The fact this has happened only twice in 20 years tells you how hard it is to do. COVID and the war in Ukraine have only added to the difficulty of achieving this by the end of this Parliament. I'm sure all members of this House recognise and understand those challenges. It would clearly be irresponsible to meet this ambition this year, and yet I refuse to let that ambition wither and drift. By 2024, the OBR currently expect inflation to be back under control, debt falling sustainably, and the economy growing. Our fiscal rules are met with a clear margin of safety. And so my final announcement today is this. I can confirm before the end of this Parliament in 2024, for the first time in 16 years, the basic rate of income tax will be cut from 20 to 19 pence in the pound. A tax cut for workers, for pensioners, for savers. A £5 billion tax cut for 30 million people. And let me be clear with the House, it is fully costed and fully paid for in the plans announced today. Last year, I told the House I would cut taxes for hard-working families, but I would do so in a responsible and sustainable way. And today, I am delivering on that promise. So let me say this. Cutting taxes is not easy. It requires hard work, prioritisation, and the willingness to make difficult and often unpopular arguments elsewhere. It is only because this government has been prepared to make those difficult but responsible choices to fix our public finances that I can stand here and tell this House that not only are taxes being cut, but the debt is also falling whilst public spending is increasing. This doesn't happen by accident, Mr. Speaker. We can deliver for the British people today and into the future because, unlike the party opposite, we have a plan. A plan that reforms and improves public services. A plan to grow our economy. A plan to level up across the United Kingdom. A plan that helps families with the cost of living. And yes, a tax plan that cuts taxes on working families by over £330, cuts taxes on fuel by 5 pence a litre, cuts taxes on business, and yes, for the first time in a long time, cuts income tax. Mr. Speaker, let me end by simply saying this. My tax plan delivers the biggest net cut to personal taxes in over a quarter of a century, and I commend it to this House.
So Rishi Sunak sitting down there, pretty dramatic end. The rabbit out of the hat, if you can call it that, is a cut in the basic rate of income tax from 20 to 19 pence by the end of the Parliament. Let's listen to Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, who is going to take to her feet in just a moment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today was the day that the Chancellor could have put a windfall tax on oil and gas producers to provide real help to families. But he didn't. Today was the day the Chancellor could have set out a proper plan to support businesses and create good jobs. Exactly. But he didn't. Yeah. Today was the day that he could have properly scrapped his national insurance hike. Yeah. He didn't. We said it was the wrong tax at the wrong time, the wrong choice. Today, the Chancellor has finally admitted he got that one wrong. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Inflation is at its highest level for 30 years and rising. Energy prices at record highs. Yeah. People are worried sick. Yeah. For all his words, it is clear that the Chancellor does not understand the scale of the challenge. Exactly. He talks about providing security for working families, but his choices are making the cost of living crisis worse, not better. Mr. Speaker, the situation following Putin's criminal assault on Ukraine remains gravely serious. Just 1 month after the invasion, so much has changed, with repercussions for years to come. But the Chancellor has failed today to explain why he chose to sign off on a reduction in our country's armed forces last October. Will the Chancellor confirm if the government's target army size is still being reduced by 10,000 troops? And let me say this to the Chancellor. Labour will support whatever is needed on defence and security to keep our country safe. Mr. Speaker, the tremors following Putin's aggression will impact on Britain, including economically. But the cost of living crisis predates Putin's attack on Ukraine. In October, inflation was already forecast to be double the Bank of England's target. And yet the Prime Minister said that fears of inflation were unfounded. Today we learned that inflation has reached 6.2% and is expected to go higher in the coming months. People are rightly looking to their government to help them weather this storm. Labour will support sensible measures to ease this pressure. But what the Chancellor has announced today says everything we need to know about his priorities. The cost of living crisis is hitting people particularly hard because incomes have been squeezed during the last 12 years of Conservative governments. Ordinary families, disabled people, pensioners, facing really difficult choices. Mums skipping meals so that their children don't. Families struggling to buy new school shoes and uniforms for their children. Older people hesitating to put the heating on because they're worried about the cost. At the weekend, the Chancellor was asked about fuel poverty, and he didn't even know the numbers. It is shameful that he doesn't, because when Martin Lewis predicts that 10 million people could be pushed into fuel poverty, the Chancellor should sit up and listen. And we know that pensions and security are not going to keep up with inflation. Pensioners and those on social security will be getting a real terms cut in their incomes.
Cutting the pension.
So what analysis has the Chancellor done on the impact of benefits being uprated by less than inflation? How many more children and pensioners will drift into poverty because of the choices of this government?
Cutting the pension.
And who does the Chancellor prioritise? He continues to defend the record profits of oil and gas producers, who themselves admit that they have more money than they know what to do with. BP describes this crisis as a cash machine for them, but it is British people who are paying out. And it is deeply regrettable that the SNP have joined the Tories in wanting to shield oil and gas producers from Labour's progressive measures. When I set out Labour's plans for a windfall tax in January, we estimated that it would have raised £1.2 billion. Now, because of the continued rise in global oil and gas prices, it would today raise over £3 billion. That's money that could be used to help families and pensioners and businesses. With a cut to VAT, a real Brexit dividend that would help working families and pensioners across our country. And a targeted warm homes discount that would see families and pensioners on the lowest and modest incomes being supported by £600. Now, today the Chancellor comes along after 12 years of failure on energy efficiency and announces a VAT cut on building materials. This is wholly inadequate. A proper energy efficiency scheme, like the one we have set out, could cut bills by £400 to people from next year. And the silence from the Chancellor on our energy-intensive manufacturing industries is appalling. At this time of national crisis, people and businesses need a government that is on their side. Now, the Chancellor spoke of difficult choices, and I agree. There are always choices to be made, like who to tax and who to shield. Despite the Chancellor's reluctant measures, the facts are that he is still taking money out of people's purses and wallets with an increase in national insurance contributions. The changes that he is making today begs the question, why did he embark on these changes in the first place, despite the warnings from the Labour Party and from many, many others? Now, it's one thing for the Prime Minister and Chancellor to disagree with each other, but the centrepiece of the statement that the Chancellor has delivered today is based on a disagreement with himself. And for all his tax rising on millions in the middle, where is the increased tax contribution for the very wealthiest in society? A landlord with a large number of properties won't be paying a penny more in taxes, but their tenants will. Someone with significant income from buying and selling stocks and shares won't be paying any more in tax, but those people powering our economy will. The Chancellor has made the wrong choices. Now, the Chancellor says we can't help everyone, and that's absolutely true. But who has the Chancellor been helping out? Those who have been swindling the taxpayer. The Chancellor left open the vaults for widespread waste, crony contracts and a frenzy of fraud. It was, as his former Tory Treasury Minister put it, happy days if you are a crook. 7 billion items of PPE not usable and now being burnt. Taxpayers' money literally going up in smoke. £3.5 billion worth of contracts awarded to friends, donors and pub landlords. And it gets worse. The Chancellor has been signing cheques to fraudsters, including organised criminals and drug dealers. Let's put the Chancellor's fraud failure in context. He has lost a staggering £11.8 billion of public money to fraud. This is twice the amount that a previous Conservative government lost on Black Wednesday. As a result of, let's face it, this jaw-dropping incompetence, the Conservatives have been funding crime instead of fighting it. And now the Chancellor has the audacity to come to British taxpayers asking them to pay more to fill his black hole. But there can be no cover-up to hide political embarrassment. Let's call in the National Crime Agency to investigate. We need answers, people held to account, because let's be clear, taxpayers want their money back. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, people can no longer afford the Conservatives. Working families can't, pensioners can't, and businesses can't. The weak growth forecast we've seen today should be flashing red on the Chancellor's desk. And the Chancellor says, in his statement today, that the work starts today. Is he serious? The Conservatives have been in government now for 12 years. 12 years. Not 12 hours. What has taken them so long? Because since his party entered government, the UK has experienced the biggest downgrade in growth of any major economy. With the last Labour government, economic growth was 2.1% a year. Under the last 12 years of the Conservatives, it's averaged 1.5%. And now we know that growth has been downgraded this year too. Now, growth is essential for funding our public services, keeping taxes under control and keeping a handle on public finances too. That's why Labour have announced a tough set of fiscal rules to get our debt and our deficit down. But the truth is that because of this government's failure to get the economy growing, it's this Chancellor that has to put up taxes on families and businesses a staggering 15 times. This Chancellor has raised taxes more in the last 2 years than any previous Chancellor in the last 50. Now, he says it's all down to the pandemic, but the truth is the Conservatives have become the party of high taxation because they are the party of low growth. Now, I understand that the Chancellor has a portrait of Nigel Lawson above his desk. Well, today we've got an energy price crisis. Record prices at the pumps. Inflation is back. The truth is, he's not Nigel Lawson, Mr. Speaker. He's Ted Heath. With an Instagram account. Labour would be getting the economy firing on all cylinders, ensuring that we buy, make and sell more in Britain, scrapping business rates and replacing them with a fairer system fit for the 21st century, something that small businesses and high street businesses are crying out for, and the Chancellor mentioned it not at all in his statement today. A climate investment pledge to decarbonise the economy, create good jobs in every part of Britain, and strengthen our energy security too. Businesses are seeing unprecedented increases in their costs right now. But all we hear from this Chancellor today is a promise of jam tomorrow, rather than the support that is needed now. And today's statement lacks the long-term plan for productivity, skills and growth. Where is it, Chancellor? Mr. Speaker, I can't help but feel that in both the Chancellor's recent May's lecture and in his statement today, we are presented with increasingly incredible claims. Perhaps the Chancellor has been taking inspiration from the characters in Alice in Wonderland, or should I say, Alice in Sunak land. Because nothing here is quite as it seems either. It's the sort of place where a Chancellor celebrates giving people £200 to help them with their spiralling energy bills before explaining that he needs it all back. In Sunak land, the Chancellor proclaims, "I believe in lower taxes," while at the same time as hiking Alice's national insurance contributions. So Alice asks the Chancellor, when did lower taxes mean higher taxes? Has down really become the new up? The Chancellor follows Humpty Dumpty's advice and says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Now, Alice knows that under the Conservatives, taxes are at their highest level in decades as a result of the policies of this very same Chancellor. In fact, this Chancellor was the only G7 finance minister to raise taxes on working people during this crucial year of recovery. Curiouser and curiouser. As Alice climbs out of the rabbit hole to leave Sunak land, she recalls the words of the White Rabbit and concludes that perhaps the Chancellor's reality is just different from yours. The actual reality, Mr. Speaker, is that this Chancellor's failure to back a windfall tax and his stubborn desire to pursue a national insurance tax rise are the wrong choices. In 8 days' time, people's energy bills will be rising by 54%. 2 weeks today, the Chancellor's latest tax hike will start hitting working people and their employers. His national insurance tax rise was a bad idea last September, and he's admitted it's an even worse one today. The Chancellor is making an historic mistake. Today was the day to scrap the tax rise on jobs. Today was the day to bring forward a windfall tax. Today was the day for the Chancellor to set out a plan to support British businesses. But on the basis of the statement today and the misguided choices of this Chancellor, families and businesses will from now on endure significant hardship as a result. The Chancellor has failed to appreciate the scale of the challenge that we face. And yet again, he is making the wrong choices for our country.
Well, that was Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, sitting down, giving her response to Rishi Sunak's spring statement. Never an easy job to do. Before we actually digest, and there is a lot to digest, you can see actually in a moment that we've got various statements and plans here in front of our panel. Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor, business editor Simon Jack, Faisal Islam, economics editor, and we are joined, I'm pleased to say, by Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Paul, just before I come to you, I'm just going to go through a couple of the measures that were announced by Rishi Sunak. The most, perhaps, eye-catching was the promise to cut the basic rate of income tax by 1 pence by the end of this Parliament, so by 2024. National insurance thresholds, which we discussed, increased by £3,000, so that is going to sort of equalise it with income tax tax personal allowance. As expected, a fuel duty cut by 5 pence per litre from 6 p.m. this evening and lasting for a year. In terms of what perhaps is going to be the most meaningful for households themselves, there seems to be a bit of giving with one hand, but still going ahead, Paul, with that national insurance rise next month of 1.25 percentage points for employees and employers.
Yep, he's still going ahead with that increase, but he's taking the sting out of that, particularly for lower earners, by increasing really quite significantly the point at which you start to pay national insurance contributions up to the same level as the income tax personal allowance at about £12,500. In the first year, at least from July, that means that people earning about £35,000, £36,000 or so per year will actually be a bit better off as a result of those two things. If you're earning more than that, you'll be worse off. But as we go further through time, because he's freezing that alongside the income tax personal allowance, then the point at which you get that, the point at which you start to get better off will come a bit further down the distribution. So this is a good policy for that particular policy will help low earners and will keep a big tax rise on the highest earners. One
of the other dramatic figures is the inflation figure. The OBR Office for Budget Responsibility saying an average of 7.4% for the rest of this year.
Yes, and a peak at towards 9% by the end of the year. And what they're also saying is that when you take account of that and their projections for what's happening to earnings, this will be the worst year, in their words, the worst year for living standards since records began in 1956.
Right.
Which is a pretty extraordinary thing to say, and actually particularly strong words from the government independent but public sector organisation, the Office of Budget Responsibility.
Well, and that, of course, then puts this cost of living crisis, as we've been discussing, into some context for millions of households. We can show you the other headlines of the dramatic figures at the beginning of Rishi Sunak's spring statement. He was very, very keen to root all the uncertainty, or certainly most of it, in the war in Ukraine, having knocked off some of his figures and forecasts from last year. As I say, the inflation forecast to average 7.4% this year, averaging. The UK growth expectation downgraded quite significantly to 3.8% this year, and then I think hovering around above and below 2% for subsequent years. The UK is to spend £83 billion on debt interest in the next year. That was 4 times, I think he said, than last year. And then £500 million new money for household support fund. That brings it up to £1 billion. What was your overall impression, Faisal?
So there's some interesting measures, but the figure that courses through all of this is that very high inflation. It sort of affects everything. It affects how much borrowing there is. It affects obviously the debt interest payments too. And you have this to reach 9% is pretty extraordinary stuff. In terms of the tax rise, that's going ahead, and then essentially in July, after 3 months, half of it gets given back mainly to lower earners in the form of a higher national insurance threshold, and then the rest of it kind of goes back via a tax cut, a 1p cut in tax, if the conditions are met in this tax plan in a couple of years' time.
Which seems rather convoluted.
Yeah, I mean, net, it means that he hasn't had to reverse the national insurance rise that was announced. But if you look at the OBR's documentation, he's now very big, saying, I'm a tax-cutting Chancellor. But he's cut back about 1/6 of all the taxes that have been raised, according to the OBR. So, you've still got the corporation tax going up. You've still got national insurance going up in people's pay packets this April, albeit some of it will be kind of given back 3 months later. You have council taxes going up. And then on the big cost of living issues that we identified, a modest amount of further help on domestic energy prices, and that 5 pence cut in fuel duty. Although, again, the OBR point out in its sort of understated way, it's rather ambitious to imagine that in a year's time you'll get a 5p plus inflation rise in fuel duty in March of 2023.
All right, politically, Laura, there were some surprises, really, from Rishi Sunak. No wonder he'd kept everything very closely guarded, particularly on the income tax announcement, although we talked about it before he actually took to his feet. And he will now claim that he can perhaps carry that mantle of being a lower tax Chancellor. Interesting, though, that he was compared to Ted Heath with an Instagram account by the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, not Nigel Lawson, she said. But this disagreement between him and Boris Johnson over that rise in national insurance contributions, do you think that that has driven to some extent today's announcement in terms of that cut in income tax and the raising of the thresholds? It simplifies the tax structure too.
Well, I suppose you refer to a disagreement there between number 10 and number 11 over the national insurance rise in the first place. And just to remind people what happened, basically, after the pandemic, the Prime Minister was determined to have more money for social care and for catching up with COVID backlogs. Rishi Sunak said, well, that's fine, but you can take a hike if you think I'm going to give you the cash for that from behind the sofa. You have to allow me to raise money somehow in order to pay for it. That's why they came up with this national insurance rise, which for the first time, on the face of it, was hypothecated. In other words, it was directly linked, and it'll appear so in people's pay slips as something going specifically towards the NHS and social care. Since then, all sorts of political backlash as to what its impact will be. Outcome today, Rishi Sunak does a significant thing, making a big rise to the level at which people will have to actually pay that tax. So that should have been a shorter version, but to give you the kind of backdrop of it. I think where it leaves Rishi Sunak is having chosen overtly, with that and the promise of an income tax, he had a windfall, a bit of freedom today in a grim picture, and he's chosen to put some of that freedom to kind of polish up his own credentials as being somebody who believes in tax cuts. That is an interesting political choice. But it also, in terms of the government explaining this, there's a bit of hokey-cokey, isn't there? Because there's a bit of, well, you can have a bit back here, but I'm going to take a bit more here. And it's whether that's coherent in terms of sort of ideological way of looking at it, I'm not so sure. But I think today, no question, it will keep quite a lot of people in the Tory party happy, because they'll be able to say, look, we're cutting income tax. Big caveat, he's promising to cut income tax in 2 years' time. And I have to say, I've never seen a Chancellor tie not just his own or potentially a successor's or a whole party's election campaign to that. Have their hands tied at this stage in the cycle.
Well, and also we've had plenty of shocks over the last few years. Who knows what may be coming down the line. What about business? Because, Simon, as you said, a lot of the measures, they weren't protected from anywhere. Yes, there's this 5p cut in fuel duty, zero VAT on certain energy-saving materials. Are these the sorts of things that will be welcome? Is it going to be enough?
The reaction I've got so far is the brutal reality is nothing in here now that touches firms today. There's no boost to business confidence. You saw, for example, although there was that exemption or the removing of the threshold for employees from 9,600 to 12,500, no change in the threshold for employers. So they're going to pay the full whack. So once again, I think they're going to feel that when it comes to getting extra money or making some adjustments here and there, they're the sort of piñata that gets hit every time until the sweets kind of fall out and they get another whack all the time. Now, and of course, the brutal reality is they weren't protected from the energy price rises, which are all pervasive and absolutely crippling. And after this budget, of course, they are unprotected from the all-pervasive crippling energy price rises. Although they did say, I think what Boris Johnson said before the Chancellor spoke was very interesting. He said that we are going to look at energy-intensive industries like steel, like ceramics, and there'll be something in the energy security package for next week.
Right. Also, politically, he did underline, Rishi Sunak, that it isn't cost-free in terms of the sanctions that have been taken by the UK government. He was very keen, again, to say that this is something that he has had to work with, even though there are calls for further sanctions, and that actually economically, or the state of the public finances, could worsen significantly over the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. I mean, that's there in black and white in his statement. He gave the figure of the amount that is now going on debt interest, over 80 billion, huge amounts of money. And he said, and you referred to the quote there, that things could get significantly worse, which is a reminder, to the public, to everybody watching today, that actually whatever he said at the dispatch box just now, it's perfectly possible that it all gets overtaken. And I think in a bigger picture sense, actually, whatever he said today, when the OBR is predicting inflation at that kind of level that Paul referenced, this might actually feel as if it is all, in a sense, I don't want to say chicken feed because there are some big measures announced here, but the big picture here may well be so challenging and so difficult for businesses and families around the country that actually the measures that Rishi Sunak is going to take might feel like they're quite small beer in the months to come.
How do you see that, Paul?
Well, they're certainly going to feel small beer to the people on the lowest incomes. The thing that was completely missing from this was anything for people on universal credit or the state pension or what have you. Don't forget, that's only going up by 3.1% next month, when inflation will probably be around 8%. So that's going to be a big cut in living standards for those on the very lowest incomes. The rest of what he's done, if you put together what he did in February with what he announced today, I mean, it really is quite, it's quite a big package, but unfortunately for him and for our living standards, it's sort of undone, or largely undone, by the fact we've got this big national insurance rise coming in as well. So you put all of that together, and there are still going to be a lot of households that are significantly worse off over the next year. But what he has done this time round is really reduce that impact, particularly for sort of lower and middle earners.
I think it's probably right to say it's a lower rise in national insurance. It's, to call it a national, people at home are going to see their national insurance bills go up in the next coming weeks. They're going to see their energy bills go up, their petrol bills are going to go up. Now, in 2 or 3 months, some of those rises will be wound back by about half or more if you're in a certain bracket. And then in 2 years' time, we should get a tax cut. But, interestingly, the tax to GDP ratio graph, which I thought, one of the ones I was trying to find from the ABR, seems to be higher than it was before. And they're getting so much money from the fact that the inflation is high and the thresholds are being kept frozen, something that Paul's IFS pointed out last week, that they can recycle some of this stuff. So the amount of tax that's coming in is still really quite high, and according to the OBR charts, still a higher historic high than it was before.
Paul?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a year ago, he announced a freezing of the income tax personal allowance for 4 years.
4 years, yeah.
Now, that's a tax rise because as earnings and inflation goes up, more and more of your income gets taken in tax. Now, it's turning out that tax rise was 2.5 times bigger than he actually thought and intended a year ago because inflation's so much higher. So Faisal's exactly right. I mean, he's introduced some of these tax cuts or sort of reduction in the size of the tax increases, but overall, the burden of taxation on the economy is not going to fall relative to what he was planning a year ago.
It's quite a clever slow burner. You do this, and then you're just reaping the revenue without having to announce it.
And is that because there is still this hope that somehow, over the next sort of 6 and 9 months, perhaps things might not get any worse? Is it trying to put off what could be a bigger decision further down the line? Because we've still got the expectation of a rise in the energy cap again in October.
Yes, and I think from the Chancellor's shoes, he will look back over the past 3 years and he will say, well, this is only possible because of the massive funding that we put in at the pandemic, which has kept unemployment far lower than we had expected.
We haven't talked about
and then, the jobs numbers again, they would have taken this with bells on if we'd said that unemployment was going to be below 4%, and in the middle you'd have a massive global pandemic. And as a result, there's enough employment income being generated that even when inflation goes up, the tax revenues go up too.
Right. I mean, in terms of jobs, I mean, it is true. Some of those predictions, or actually most of those predictions, just haven't happened. People have remained with high levels of employment, which will, to some extent, take the sting.
As we were saying before he got on his feet, what business groups feared is that if you look at the unemployment rate, you look at corporate tax receipts, you look at February's GDP number and everything, actually things are robust enough for me to actually park some of my ammo until October, and that's what the business community feared. And they said for many businesses who are being exposed post-COVID recovery type vehicles to the full glare of these energy price rises, it may be too late, and business confidence is always flagging. Just one other question I'd almost like to sort of put to everyone, really, which is that when he puts through this national insurance rise on both employers and employees, it was a £12 billion tax rise. He's now giving half of that back. At the time, he sold that as an earmarked fund. Every single penny will go to NHS and social care. Well, does that mean £6 billion now less goes to NHS and social care?
It was remarkably said it in his speech.
It was a fiction at the time, wasn't it?
But he repeated that fiction. He says, I've got to increase national insurance rate because every penny will go to the NHS, and then he
took it away again.
£6 billion off it. Yes. But it's a myth. It's simply not true that it has anything to do with the amount of money that goes to the NHS.
The other thing to really watch now is public sector pay, because the HM Treasury put out a little noticed paper into the pay review bodies, all the pay review bodies, kind of saying, yeah, we know inflation is going to go up to 5-ish% as it was then, but, you know, keep your eye on the 2% target. That's what's important. Well, it's now gone up to 6, heading up to 9 as a peak, but it's going to be at this 6, 7, 8 level for the rest of the year. So it's much more difficult now for the government to turn around to teachers and nurses, everybody really, police officers, and say, oh, no, you need to stick to 3 or 4%. And we've seen nothing, I haven't read all the documents yet, we've seen nothing on that, and that is 6 million workers. And the pay review bodies aren't due to report until July. But the pay will be set at 3%. So another thing, they will get this real terms pay cut next month.
Right.
And
I mean, that is going to focus minds, isn't it, in terms of people wanting to call for pay, pay rises?
Yeah, I mean, the government's put evidence into the School Teachers Review Body already, saying it wants experienced teachers to get 3% pay rises. That's after so that would be a 5% real cut on top of 8 or 9% real cuts over the last decade. So, and again, the OBR points this out. There's a lot more pressure now on these public spending totals. Public spending totals set in cash terms back in October, when inflation looked like it might be 4%, it's now looking like it'd be 8%. So these are much smaller real increases for departments. Now, in a sense, they have a choice. They can give the workers there's £250 billion we spend on public sector pay. If they increase pay for the workers there in line with inflation, then obviously it's a lot less for more teachers or more nurses or what have you. So they could increase pay in line with inflation, or they could leave them getting a great deal worse off in real terms relative to the private sector as well.
Right, just before, because I think you have to go, Paul, we showed this graph earlier. We didn't spend that much time on it. I don't know if you can see it, the tax changes by the last 10 prime ministers. This is in relation to percentage of GDP. How does that change from the announcements today, or is that too difficult
off
to
the
do off the top of your head? Not all of them, not all of them.
1.3.
So Rishi Sunak has now announced some tax cuts on top of the tax increases that he announced before. But as we were saying earlier, the outturn of some of the tax increases he announced before is going to be bigger than he intended. So if you look at the actual change in the tax burden over this Parliament, it's not going to have changed that much.
Paul Johnson, thank you very much for joining us. I think in a few minutes' time we're going to be joined by Helen Whateley from the Government, Treasury Minister, Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, and we'll be putting a lot of these points to her. We'll also be joined by Labour and representatives from the other parties. Laura?
I just think all of the specifics that we've been talking about, and there is a lot in this, even though it was a very short spring statement as these things go, but there is one chart that the OBR has published in its book, which comes up with a very stark conclusion. They just say they expect real household disposable income, which is basically the sort of best way of how we measure how people feel about whether or not they can afford their lifestyle, whether they've got any money left at the end of the month. But they expect it to fall this year at the fastest rate since comparable records began in the 1950s. Just
this
think
is the biggest
about that for a moment. Whatever the specifics, whatever the fine details of all of the proposals, and of course it's really important to look at the nuance and the different details in black and white, the overall picture for the public, for the politicians, is going to be one that's very, very testing in the next year, in the next couple of years into the run into this next
and if people don't feel better by the time of the next general election, I mean, this could still cost the Conservatives dear, couldn't it? Because, as you say, they can point to all sorts of measures that have been taken that you've outlined, Faisal and Simon, less so, of course, for businesses, certainly, at the moment. But if people feel worse off, as the big political question is, So are you going to feel better or worse off by the time of the next election? Then that will cost them at the ballot box.
Absolutely, and the government's very well aware of that. It's that backdrop for, you know, if people feel skint and hard up, they're more likely to feel angry with the people who've been in charge. And some of it, as Rishi Sunak was very careful to point out at the beginning of his statement, is way beyond the government's control. Yeah. But then the government at the end of the day is responsible for making the decisions about how much tax we pay, what they spend our money on, how much we're actually all left with at the end of the month. And the picture is very, very challenging, notwithstanding what you were just talking about, you know, employment. If we'd sat here this time last year, the employment figures, the government would have bitten your hand off for that to be the case.
It's just worth to try and flesh out Laura's point about the squeeze on standards. So we're talking about, in terms of the tax rise that came in, is a few £100s for a typical household, and this will have rolled back about half of that. We know that for a typical home, the energy bills have gone up about £700 for that bill, and stand to go up a few £100s more in autumn. Petrol bills, typical car owner, and these aren't necessarily the same people, so you can't just add these up, but it gives you an idea, about £500 a year if petrol prices stay where they are, though obviously the 5p cut will help with a small amount of that. So you can sort of see the sense in... That's why, even though you have had some cuts in taxes, the real disposable income is still being squeezed, as Laura describes, by the fastest amount that we have on record.
Well, that seems a good point to welcome Helen Whateley, Treasury Minister. Welcome to this Politics Live special and to viewers on the News Channel. Biggest fall in living standards in any financial year since records began in 1956. So says the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility. How can you justify that?
Well, these are tough times that we're living in. We've just come through the pandemic, which clearly was a huge hit to the economy in the UK and around the world. In fact, though, we're recovering really strongly from that, with the fastest growth in the G7 that we saw last year.
Because of the sharpest contraction, of course, in the years before.
We're seeing really strong growth. And an important part of that is clearly the support that the government gave to people and businesses through that pandemic, which has helped us come out very strongly. We know on the back of that, we now have the war in Ukraine, which is making things even harder globally. So just let me set it out, we already saw high rates of inflation globally coming out of the pandemic with the recovery and extra demand, and high energy prices. War in Ukraine making those things harder. What the Chancellor set out in his spring statement just now is the steps that we're taking, some of the steps we're taking to support people here and now, and tax cuts to support people with the extra cost of living, and an overall tax plan to bring down the tax burden for people. But just one moment, two other things which are really important to mention he talked about, which is how we're committed to driving growth and supporting businesses, which are the engine of growth. That's how we will improve people's living standards in years to come. And then looking ahead, being able to share those proceeds of growth through a future income tax, income tax cut. Really important, all of those three strands of what we're doing.
Right, and that does set out, to some extent, a long-term plan. It's right now. We're talking about how people feel right now. Energy costs going up perhaps £700 in people's bills. There has been some sort of rebate plan that we'd already heard to cover half of that. The growth you talk about, well, it's actually been downgraded quite significantly to 3.8%. Do you accept that the sort of cost of living challenges that are being faced by the UK now preceded the war in Ukraine? It cannot all be laid at the door of the invasion of Ukraine.
I don't think anyone's suggesting, and I certainly haven't, and the Chancellor hasn't, that it's all to do with Ukraine. In fact, 2 minutes ago, I set out how we know that the recovery from the pandemic, in fact, is one of the reasons of driving inflation globally and energy costs as part of that. So we have got not just Ukraine, also the pandemic that we're coming through. I will say I think it's important that we take a long-term approach and that we've set out a tax plan that looks further ahead. However, no, but you're completely right on the cost of living challenges here and now. That's absolutely why, including
so why
announced
don't you just
today...
get rid of those national insurance contributions, the hike in national insurance contributions? There has been, as Laura called it, something of a hokey-cokey when it comes to that. Why not just get rid of them, admit it was the wrong thing to do? In a way, Rishi Sunak sort of did that with his statement today and the measures that he announced by increasing the threshold at which you would start to pay it by quite a dramatic £3,000. Just get rid of the tax hike altogether.
I disagree with your interpretation of what we've set out. As I was just in the middle of saying, I did just want to say, tax cuts today, specifically fuel duty, helping people here and now. That reduction in fuel duty will come in this evening to help people with the very real cost that they're facing, filling up their cars, whether it's to go to work or drop the kids to school, or the day-to-day things of life. And then the national insurance cut that you've just mentioned, which will save the average employee £330 a year. And that will mean that for the majority of people, around 70%, that will mean overall, even including the health and social care levy, they will actually see a fall in their national insurance contributions. But still, actually, the health and social care levy is important. It's really important because we know that the NHS and social care are people's #1 priority. We committed as a government to reform social care. We know we have an NHS backlog. This is setting up a long-term revenue stream to fund those things, and also will mean that those with the broadest shoulders will be contributing more to the NHS.
Faisal?
But you are essentially going to cut the basic rate of income tax, but fund it from having raised national insurance. You're shifting the tax system from your normal income tax that affects everybody, savers, buy-to-let landlords, and you're focusing it on workers. You're increasing a tax on jobs.
I wouldn't see it that way. I'd say, if you look at it, there's what we're doing here and now, which is to help people with the cost of living. Also making sure that work pays. That's a really important priority for us. As you saw back in the budget, we announced and have already implemented the cut to the universal credit, the change universal credit taper rate, which is essentially a tax cut for those on the lowest incomes, national living wage going up imminently, also to increase the incomes of those on the lowest paid. But looking ahead, yes, we do want to be able to bring down income tax. That's really, really important. Something that Conservative chancellors often want to do, and only sometimes manage to do. So that's what we're committed to doing, looking further ahead.
Minister, the public's not going to be kidded that you're a tax-cutting government when you've just raised the taxes, then given it back to them over a period of years.
So what we have done with the health and social care levy is a very specific revenue stream.
It's not, because you're not going to cut the health and safety, health and social funding. You're not going to cut that now by £6 billion. That was a myth that it was ever hypothecated.
No, so what's happening is the revenue from that will go to the NHS and to fund the social care reforms that we're putting into place. Now, we've already made commitments through the spending review for the funding for health and social care.
So that was a total waste of time.
But what we are doing, and that does mean that those with the broader shoulders, as I said, are going to be contributing more to the NHS. Remember, #1 priority for the British public. And although, yes, here and now we do face cost of living challenges, we will get through this, we will have stronger growth, and then we'll be in a position, we've got that long-term revenue stream and cut people's income tax. Really important thing.
It's a techie point, though, because you're talking about tax cutting, but the public is literally going to see the full whack of the national insurance rise in their pay packets next month. So it does look like you didn't really want to go ahead with it, because you're then going to give it back in July. It's a bit odd. That's not ideal tax planning, really, is it, from a governmental perspective?
Well, actually, so the tax plan that the Chancellor, you've got it set out in front of you.
Well, it doesn't mention any of the tax rises.
It's both to cut taxes and also to simplify them. That is part of what we're doing here, and we can go into the thresholds and how that works. But let's also keep it simple here now. Overall, this is going to work out as a national insurance cut.
Right, but you say let's keep it simple. But Rishi Sunak said the income tax cut is worth £5 billion. The IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, we just had Paul Johnson, said last week that the previously announced tax rises are worth £46 billion. So how does that work out in any way as being tax cutting or better for households and taxpayers?
So, as I set out, we're in a context which is a challenging one for any government to be in. Global pandemic, war in Ukraine, global inflation, energy costs. We've taken steps to support people through the pandemic, through those really hard times. We're supporting people with cost of living. We're committed to growth and, in the long term, bringing people's taxes down. But, of course, we know we need to be fiscally responsible. This is really important. It could be very tempting to borrow more, but actually that's not responsible, because then you're just passing debt on to future generations, which we're committed not to doing.
But it was a political choice to increase taxes. In terms of businesses, the announcements that have been made as well are longer term. Businesses now, some of them are facing going to the wall.
Do you mind if I just sort of show this document?
No.
Faisal, these are the tax cuts down here. Presumably this page didn't make it to the printers, because right here we've got the tax rise for employers not employees, is unchanged, going ahead at £6 billion. And also here in April 2023, there's a corporation tax rise, which in a stroke wipes out 10 years of Tory tax cutting. So you can see a whopping rise from 19 to 25%. And I think the fear that we talked about was that the Chancellor's taken a gamble that if you look at GDP in February, you look at corporate tax receipts, you look at GDP, you look at the unemployment rate, you think, do you know what, the economy looks robust enough for now. I can keep my powder dry for October. Most of the business groups and bosses I talk to say that's a massive gamble. We are unprotected from the crippling and all-pervasive energy cost rises. We're not going to see any relief from the national insurance rise that you've announced today. Business confidence is already flagging, and once it's lost, it's much harder to get back in October. About October, for many businesses, it will be too late. I'll just give you one other statistic. In February, there was a 23% rise in corporate insolvencies. We could be seeing a massacre of a lot of companies which were supported through COVID and are now fully exposed to the ravages of what we're seeing of the inflationary pressures.
Well, earlier this week, I was talking to the FSB, Federation of Small Businesses. One of the things they were asking for is one of the things that the Chancellor has announced today, which is the increase in the employment allowance, which is essentially a £1,000 tax cut to many thousands of small businesses as well, enabling them to employ more people without that national insurance cost. So we are supporting businesses in the here and now. We're really committed to growth. The Chancellor mentioned some of the Help to Grow schemes that we have to help businesses, smaller businesses, become more productive. They're the lifeblood of our economy. We absolutely support business. And also he signalled the conversations that he wants to have with businesses between now and the budget on increasing and supporting business investment. We really want to support business investment because we know that is the way that we will
exactly.
grow.
And it's can you imagine a scenario in which a business looking at their energy bills, looking at their tax bills, says there's nothing left for me to invest, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such poor growth numbers 1, 2, 3 years out.
Well, so we are taking steps, particularly that one I just mentioned, to support the smaller businesses with some of the costs they face. We can't solve all of the problems, but the Chancellor really does this. And as I say, there's a conversation as how we can help businesses invest more, particularly in R&D, particularly supporting innovation, particularly to drive up our productivity and our commitment to skills, which is crucial for our economy.
All right, Helen Whateley, Treasury Minister, thank you very much for joining us so quickly after that spring statement from the Chancellor and response from Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor. We can join Fiona Trott, who is still in Darlington at the market there, and hopefully can get some reaction from people who have listened to that statement. Over to you, Fiona.
That's right, yes. Well, you'll remember we were speaking to one market trader here earlier who's been here for 70 years, and he said that the cost of living for him had never felt so severe. This morning, people here were wanting to feel optimistic after the Chancellor's statement. So how do they feel now? Let's speak now to Kirsty Wilbur. You run a ladies' clothing store here, and Diane Lodge, you're joining us again. You run a local haulage business. So first of all, Kirsty, what do you think? You heard what the Chancellor has to say. What are your first impressions?
So the national insurance is a little bit of a help to me. It means I don't have to worry about earning so much so fast. So that gives me a little bit more leeway, so that's a good thing for me.
And when we were speaking to you earlier, Diane, of course, diesel, the cost of that is a big thing for you. 5p cut in duty, what do you think?
5p per litre. Not so good. Not so good for us as a haulage company. It's not going to make much difference at all. 20p would have been brilliant. Not that that was ever going to happen, but 5p for the everyday motorist. Hopefully that will help people get around with the summer coming, etc. And, you know, filling the cars up a little bit cheaper than it would have cost.
Looking at Kirsty there, because you are a mum of 4, you do run around in the car. Is that going to make your life easier?
No, 5p isn't going to make much difference at all. I mean, I fill my tank twice a week just to get to and from Northallerton to here to work.
How much does that cost?
So to fill my tank, I'm looking at about £70. And it's a lot. I'm a mum of 4 and I've just started a new business. I've only been here since October, so it's not going to make much difference to me at all, hence why I'm going to get a train pass, because it's cheaper for me to get the train than it is to...
start using the train still, despite today's announcement, instead of your car?
10p would have made a massive difference, but 5p is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. It won't help me. I've got to do wholesale runs to 3 different wholesalers. So when you calculate all that in together, 5p is nothing.
The Chancellor also talking about growth in business then. Do you feel today that your business is going to grow over the next year, next 2 years?
I think businesses as a whole will probably stay on par right now. You're going to have to work hard to make it stay that, because everything is going up, from the cost of diesel to the ferry costs to the just paying to get in and out of the country since Brexit. That's gone up hugely. Paperwork's gone up 20-fold, not 10-fold as we thought. We had to employ a full-time person just to cover Brexit, and now we've got to put on extra costs and look at how much more it's costing us. I.e., we've had to put a fuel surcharge on all our customers, unfortunately, which will be reviewed once a month. Hopefully it'll come down a little bit, but 5p isn't going to make very much difference at all. I won't see a difference in that. I know that to fill an Arctic wagon up, the price of the fuel has gone up a third since this time last year, a full third. So if it was 600, it's 600 now, it was 400 last year.
Because you run your own store.
I do.
Okay. What the Chancellor said today, has that helped you plan ahead?
No. So nothing was laid out enough for... I'm just your average mum. I'm not a business person. I'm only just setting out in business now. And it wasn't laid out in layman's terms for somebody else to understand and prepare and have things in place beforehand. So, no, I don't think it's helped me at all.
What are you having to do now then to manage? What decisions are you making?
So I'm holding off going to wholesalers as much. So my stock's going down lower, which is then decreasing my sales because I haven't got the stock there. But I have to hold back because I can't afford to go to 3 different wholesalers once a month. I can't afford to do it.
Thank you both very much for giving us your reaction to what the Chancellor had to say this afternoon. The more people you speak to here in and around Darlington Market, you get the feeling that they already know what the state of the economy is like. They feel it. And while the Chancellor today has made announcements that will affect them, the 5p cut in fuel duty, for example, the people here in Darlington who are already struggling are on benefits. They don't have a car, so they're telling us they're still going to have to find ways to try and save money elsewhere.
Fiona Trott, thank you very much. Fiona there at the market in Darlington, speaking to our guests there. We can welcome Pat McFadden, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He's there for us at Central Lobby. Hello to you, Pat. Labour have long been saying, and Rachel Reeves repeated it, that actually Rishi Sunak has been a tax-raising Chancellor. But today he has promised to cut the basic rate of income tax by 1 pence, certainly by 2024. He said he is increasing the threshold, I should say, at which you start paying national insurance contributions by £3,000, equalising it with income tax, and that is a £6 billion tax cut that will benefit 70% of all workers. So do you want to change your mantra about Rishi Sunak?
No, we learned three things today in this statement. The first is that we're about to be hit with the biggest hit in living standards on record. That is what the OBR have said today, certainly the biggest in the post-war period. Nothing that was said today is going to change that. The second thing to your question about tax is this has now become a game of smoke and mirrors with one purpose in mind and one overriding criteria, and that is the Tory party election grid. For 6 months we've been told that there needed to be a £12 billion rise in national insurance. And if you queried that, you were against funding for the NHS. And now the government has done this partial U-turn on it, giving the lie to that argument in the first place. And secondly, he is proposing, uniquely among G7 countries, to impose this national insurance rise on households struggling with energy bills, and then to cut tax by roughly the same amount a year or two later, just so it chimes with the Tory election campaign. Families don't need pain piled onto them now to fit with Boris Johnson's election plans. They shouldn't be asked to pay for this cost. And the more I listen to him today, the more it begged the question, why are you doing this at all?
Right. In terms of the money for the NHS and the health and social care levy, Pat, we still don't know how Labour would raise that sort of money, the billions that are needed to deal with the backlog in the NHS?
The Tories are going to raise it. It's clearly not for the NHS and social care. Look, that has all been blown apart today. He said he needed 12 billion for the NHS and social care, and now he's announced that he's going to give 6 billion back. So he clearly either didn't need that money or it was never going to social care in the first place. This is not what this was about. This was about a political decision to impose tax rises now in order for Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak to try to get the public to be grateful when they cut them in 2 years' time. Right. I've been saying this for about 6 months and people have been saying, how do you know that's the plan? Well, the Chancellor's just announced that that's the plan.
Right, but I still haven't heard your plan. How much money do you think the NHS needs to deal with the backlog?
Look, of course the NHS needs resources, and any sensible opposition sets out its tax plans when it comes to the election. If it can change this much in 6 months, just since this national insurance increase was announced, think how much circumstances can change in 2 years. That's when we'll do it, and that's the sensible time to do it.
Do you accept that the circumstances have, you say they're political choices, and you're absolutely right, but do you accept that the circumstances of the pandemic, followed very swiftly by the war in Ukraine, has put an enormous strain on both public finances, and because of the actions taken by the government to put pressure on the Putin regime, is having consequences here?
Of course, that's true here and it's true around the world. But what makes Britain stand out? What makes Britain stand out is not the inflationary pressures, they're happening in other countries too. What makes Britain stand out is the decision of the government to impose tax increases on working people in the middle of it all. We're the only country in the G7 to do that. Now that begs the question, why is it being done? It's clearly not for the NHS and social care because he's just done a partial reversal of it, but he's given us the answer today. He's doing it in order so that he can somehow try to give it back in the form of a 1p income tax cut just before the next election. I repeat, what is the point of this hokey-cokey dance on taxation?
Right, Pat, you will probably know, and if you don't, I'm going to tell you that I have my guests here in the studio, Laura Kuenssberg, Simon Jack and Faisal Islam, who will put some questions to you as well. Laura, you may want to go first.
Pat, in terms of what you've described as the sort of hokey-cokey of, you know, raising NI and then giving some of it back to some people, will Labour vote against or object to him increasing those thresholds? Because it's one thing having objections to it, but will you actually try and stop it happening?
We won't object to him increasing the threshold, but we've already said all the way along and have voted against the national insurance rise.
But you don't therefore think that it's a mistake for him to actually do it, rather tinkering with the thresholds, you will back that?
Well, look, if it makes it easier for people, of course we will. But Laura, it goes back to what we were saying. We never accepted this idea that this was a hypothecated 12 billion a year plan for the NHS and social care. And the reason we never accepted it was because I and others had a suspicion all along that the plan was actually to levy this national insurance increase now so that the Tories would then be in a position to cut tax before the election. And the reason that's a particularly bad idea is because people are struggling so much with the cost of living. Up until a couple of hours ago, that was just a suspicion of the opposition. Now it has been confirmed by the Chancellor, and the idea that this was a hypothecated tax for health and social care has been completely blown out of the water by today's statement.
But Pat McFadden, you don't know today, though, do you, that the government is not going to put find that $6 billion for the NHS somewhere else? I mean, as you suggest, they've taken it away from the NI rise, but you can't say today that that £6 billion is actually going to come out of the NHS spending budget.
They haven't said anything
about that. Right, so you don't know that.
They haven't said anything about that. If the government says today that they're going to raise $6 billion from somewhere else, let's hear them say that. Right. But so far, I've certainly not heard anything about that this afternoon.
Faisal.
Pat, it's Faisal Islam here. I just want to step back from the minutiae here and just think about the scale of the sort of package required here. I mean, clearly 2 years ago, the pandemic, £400 billion put in. Here, I mean, we just noticed the people that we interview, everybody is feeling some sort of squeeze, just about managing falling into poverty, and then people on normal incomes feeling like they're just about managing. You're still really in the same ballpark of what the government is doing, maybe a little bit more generous in your view. You're not talking about a massive rescue package. Isn't it important to make that clear with the public?
Well, let me give you one important difference. There was a a tax that Rishi Sunak didn't turn to today, which is the proposal that we made for a one-off windfall levy on the excess profits of the oil and gas companies. They're making an absolute fortune right now. We heard the quotes in the chamber, the chief executive of BP calling the current market a cash machine for his company. He could have raised several £billion from that and made his energy package more generous. We proposed that he do that, and if he did that, then he might not be in a position of giving people a loan of £200 in October. He might actually be in a position to take £200 off bills, or help people at the poorest end more than he's doing already. But he has firmly turned his face away from that and is persisting with this hokey-cokey dance around national insurance.
Well, the reason why he's not going for a windfall tax is because that will necessarily reduce production domestically. Your party doesn't back production from imports from Russia, was criticising imports from Saudi Arabia. Where are we going to get the energy that we need from?
I don't accept this thing, the argument that Rishi Sunak's wielding about investment. When the oil and gas companies made their investment plans, they made them on the assumption of oil and gas prices far lower than they are right now. And when they announced their profits, both Shell and BP didn't announce major new investment plans. I'll tell you what they announced, which was increased dividend payments and increased share buybacks. So this is not being used for a new wave of investment. It is being used for share buybacks and increased dividend plans. It's a classic windfall. That's why the former Chief Executive of BP, Lord John Browne, said that a windfall tax is justified. So if the former Chief Executive of the company says it's justified, I think that's a pretty good reason for Rishi Sunak to look at this again.
Pat, Simon Jack here
Just on that windfall tax, I mean, some people you speak to say, look, the fact that oil and gas prices are so high means there will be a taxed windfall all of it on its own. Therefore, you don't really need a windfall tax. And if you can encourage more investment in the North Sea, the North Atlantic, then all of that extra income, that production can be taxed here rather than elsewhere. Those are some of the arguments out there, although it has to be said that even the economics editor of the FT was arguing, like John Browne was, for that to happen. I just wanted to ask you a question. Do you have any sympathy with the Chancellor, who looks at GDP rising pretty strongly in February? You've got unemployment much lower than anyone thought that was possible. Corporate deposits are quite high. Corporate tax receipts are looking good. Actually, it makes quite a lot of sense for business to wait a little bit and keep some powder dry for October when you see where it's really needed. Was he right, in a way, to sort of talk about jam tomorrow because he needs to see how things settle down because they're so volatile?
Well, I make 2 points in response to that, Simon. First of all, the people who are saying that, I don't know if they're saying it to you with a straight face, given what they've said when the annual results of the oil and gas companies were announced. But on your point about waiting and uncertainty, look, a lot of this comes down to a broader argument we've been making about economic growth. The Chancellor wants to put all of this down to the pandemic, to say that he has become the high-tax Chancellor that he is because of the pandemic. But it's not just because of the pandemic. It's because of anemic economic growth for 12 years. One of the extraordinary things that the Chancellor said was we need better economic growth, and the work on that starts today. This government hasn't been in power for 12 weeks or 12 days. It's been in power for 12 years. And one of the reasons we've arrived at the highest tax burden in 70 years is because we've had such an anemic record on economic growth since the government came into office.
Pat McFadden, thank you very much. Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury there for us in Central Lobby. I think we can go almost immediately to speak to the SNP's Stephen Flynn. Stephen, oh, you're there. Thank you for waiting patiently for us. First of all, your reaction and initial response to what you heard Rishi Sunak say.
I think the overwhelming response from most people in the chamber today is that as it stands, we know that inflation is at a 30-year high and it's only going to get worse. We know that energy bills are going to be reaching some £3,000 a year by the autumn. We know that we're going to see a fall in living standards, the biggest since the 1950s. And it appears that the Chancellor's only response to that is to do a tax cut on national insurance, having already hiked national insurance, and to take 5p a litre off of petrol, having already seen a situation where petrol tanks are going up by 40p. a litre. So yeah, it's overwhelmingly a case of, is that it, and what planet is the Chancellor living on? People need support, they need it now, and he's not delivered.
Right, he has increased by 500 million to £1 billion the household support. Of course, Rishi Sunak did say that he had already come forward with a scheme to help people pay their energy bills. Not all of the increase that is expected by millions of families, but certainly billions being put forward for a rebate for all families. No, sorry, not the rebate, not for all families, the loan of £200 to all families and a rebate for households in those bands A to D. So you can't say he hasn't done anything, Stephen.
I'm not sure a buy now, pay later loan is the answer that people are needing at this moment in time. You know, when I look in my inbox, I see people really struggling, concerned about whether they can heat their home or feed their children, whether they can buy their kids clothes for nursery or go and fill up their car. And the reality is that the Chancellor has not responded accordingly. What he should have done today was reverse his cut to universal credit. What he should have done today was match the Scottish Government's 6% uplift in benefits, and what he could and indeed should have done today is to turn that loan into a grant to provide families with the support that they need at this really difficult moment in time. And let's face facts, it's only going to get worse, and his response today just doesn't cut it. Right,
did you welcome the announcement by Rishi Sunak of increasing the threshold national insurance contributions, and when they'll kick in by £3,000, so equalising it with income tax, personal allowance? That's a £6 billion tax cut to 70% of all workers.
I think everyone welcomes that, but what we're all confused about is the fact that just a matter of months ago, the Chancellor decided to hike national insurance. So here we are, and just a matter of months later, and he's saying that he's taken some of that money back. But ultimately, that money doesn't go far enough. It equates to about £300 a year for those earning less than £35,000 a year. £300 a year versus a £3,000 energy bill is nothing. It does not go far enough. Families are struggling. The Chancellor needed to stand up today, and what we've seen is him fail to deliver once again. But we know that this is the record of the Tory government. They could have invested in people, they could have put money back into people's pockets, but instead they've gone down their traditional route of austerity, something that we've seen over the course of the last 12 years, as Pat rightly outlined before me.
Now, you mentioned the word austerity. Of course, Rishi Sunak very keen to stress that this is off the back of he, in his words, and Boris Johnson's words, doing whatever it takes to help people through the pandemic. And I think even the SNP and Labour acknowledge that that was an extremely generous scheme in terms of furlough. Then to be hit by the war in Ukraine, that steps have been taken today to try and mitigate to some extent the pain that you are talking about. Do you have some sympathy with the Chancellor in terms of the steps he took?
I think we need to focus on the facts here. The Chancellor is raking it in from income tax receipts, from inheritance tax receipts, from VAT receipts, from North Sea oil and gas receipts, and in turn what he's done is give just a pittance to people to get them through the cost of living crisis. Yes, the situation in Ukraine is extremely grave, and yes, it's impacted upon the situation more than we were already seeing, because the cost of living crisis was in place before that. But the levers were there for the Chancellor today to take real action to support people, and not a single mention of universal credit that I heard today. And yet this is the same person who just a matter of months ago took £20 per week out of those on universal credit, out of their pockets, at a time when he knew that the cost of living was going to increase. And as I'll repeat, because it needs to be repeated, fuel bills are going to be around £3,000 a year in the autumn. £3,000 a year, and the best he can muster is £300. It's not good enough.
Stephen Flynn, thank you very much. And now the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, is with us in Central Lobby. Hello to you, Ed. Again, your reaction to what the Chancellor said, first of all.
This is a total swindle from the Chancellor. He's giving with one hand and taking with another. You know, we're facing a cost of living crisis, according to the OBR, the worst for over 50 years. Inflation already at the highest for 40 years. You know, people are drowning with those higher energy bills, those higher motoring costs, those higher food bills. They needed a lifeboat, and the Chancellor's utterly failed them. You know, we're seeing cost of living where he's done nothing. He's done nothing on eye-watering inflation. And one point that's not being made and heard enough is that's nothing for schools and hospitals, who will see their budgets severely cut by higher inflation.
Right, what sort of package? Give us a sense of the scale of what sort of package you would like to have seen in sort of cash terms going to stand by hard-working families.
Well, at least 2 or 3 times larger than this. I mean, we proposed a cut in VAT, which would have cost £18 billion £100, a one-year cut in value added tax, that would have been worth £600 a year for the average family. It would have also cut headline inflation and helped reflate the economy, bring help to struggling businesses, particularly on the high street. That sort of bold measure was what Liberal Democrats wanted and were arguing for. The Chancellor's done nothing like that.
In terms of jobs, we have talked a bit about employment. Levels of employment are high. They have been high, perhaps surprisingly, ever since the sort of almost not the end of the pandemic, but as we were coming out of the pandemic and the war hit. You would accept that at least on that front, things have been more positive.
Well, yes, but we're seeing skill shortages, we're seeing labour shortages. The problem, as many of us forecast, is that our health service, our care homes don't have the staff they need. Every business I speak to, every business representation organisation I speak to, from the CBI to the Federation of Small Business, the British Chambers of Commerce, they're all complaining that their members don't have the staff they need. So if we're going to grow our economy sustainably, grow it out of this appalling situation we're in, we're going to have to find that labour from somewhere. And there's nothing in that. This wasn't an economic strategy. I say this, but this was more designed to make the Chancellor look good to the backbenchers than it was to help people struggling with their bills and to help our economy.
Well, who would have thought it? A politician trying to make themselves look good. Excuse my cynicism there. But you say there was no longer...
He should be looking after our country. He's too busy fighting a leadership election in case Boris Johnson falls under a bus. We have a serious crisis in our country. The Chancellor's job is to focus on that crisis for millions of families. And he's not done that.
Well, you say there's no plan. I mean, in front of me here, I've got various pieces of paper, including a tax plan. Rishi Sunak said he was trying to set out some sort of strategy for the longer term, which, yes, did include a rather eye-catching cut to the basic rate income tax by 1 pence. But that will be, you know, well received.
Well, this is why I call it a swindle. He's reducing income tax at the same time as increasing national insurance. Guess what? The people who will benefit from the income tax cut include people with huge investment earnings, landlords and so on, and they won't pay the higher national insurance. The higher national insurance will be paid particularly by low-paid workers and small businesses. That is not the right priority for our economy or for people who are struggling. That's why it's a swindle. And you can say that about the national insurance threshold. Now, Liberal Democrats really want to take low-paid people out of tax. We argue that, we delivered that when we were in government. But what the Chancellor is doing is another swindle. He's freezing the income tax personal allowance, which is bringing millions of low-paid people back into income tax, while he's raising the national insurance threshold. People shouldn't be fooled by this smoke and mirrors, where he's raising an allowance and cutting allowance, where he's raising a tax and cutting a tax. I'm afraid this is not good management of our tax system.
Ed Davey, Liberal Democrat leader, thank you very much. Let's spend the final minutes of this special programme to think about some of the consequences politically and then obviously on economics and business. Politically, it's interesting, the language that's being used. This is a swindle, this is the hokey-cokey, this is smoke and mirrors. It's not the first time a Chancellor has been said to have done... accused of such things. But, you know, will it come back to haunt Rishi Sunak and the government at large, because there is a sense of giving and taking back, or taking back and then giving a little bit to households, during which time, as we said before, people aren't going to feel very well off.
Well, I think in the last few minutes I've just been looking at the responses from some of the think tanks on left and right. And on the right, you've got one of them putting forward saying the Chancellor giveth and the Chancellor taketh away. And I think there will be quite a lot of political hubbub around this idea that he's trying to style himself as a tax cutter, but he's cutting a tax in the form of NI, which is one that he'd already raised, and he's promising a tax cut in 2 years' time that he may not be enabled to enact. So that is something very significant, and I think that there will be political questioning of that. The second point, where I think that he is vulnerable, which you're seeing in the response from the think tanks and academics on the left-hand side of the spectrum, is that there wasn't anything today that really addresses how tough things might be for people who really find it hard to make ends meet. So those on benefits, there was nothing in the statement for people on benefits, apart from an extra £500 million that will go to local authorities.
And they will be able to help those
to pass on to those who are really struggling with bills. But that kind of sense of immediate help that people were really calling for. There's some question marks about whether...
Well, and on that, we have only got a few minutes. I'll get to both of you. But on pensions and on benefits, if we're talking about, in the way Rishi Sunak said, helping the most disadvantaged, the most vulnerable, well, he hasn't in that sense. Well, not those groups.
And there's a real structural difference with the measures in this statement. Often in budgets, we're talking about very sort of micro measures and they become big stories, whether it's on pasties or, you know, whatever. But here, because of the nature of the economic situation that we're in, it's affecting 10 million, 15 million people or millions of pensioners. So when you look at the indexation issue, inflation, we're now told, is going to average 7.4% for the whole year. OK, so the difference between giving 3.1%, which is what we thought inflation might have been, and 6.2%, which is where it is, and 7% where it's going to average, and 8%, which is where it might go, is huge and costs many billions of pounds. Add in the public sector pay, add in the universal credit, and remember, people, you know, many people on tax credits don't consider themselves necessarily to be benefit recipients, right? A lot of them are exactly the voters that the Conservative Party attracted over from the Labour Party. You put the politics and economics into a giant kind of blender, and this is very, very stretched. And they won't. I don't think people will be. You know, when you're told I'm cutting your taxes, and literally people will look at pay packets next month,
and it won't.
And it won't
look like that. And in terms of businesses, if they're going to be the drivers, as they're always described, of the economy, and we've seen the growth forecasts cut and then hovering around that slightly anemic level of below 2% or 2%. You know, how are they going to plan?
Yeah, a big growth cut for this year and next, and down to under 2% for the rest of the Parliament. That's really bad news for the public finances because growth is the biggest debt killer. Little jam today for them today. They didn't get spared anything of their contribution to the national insurance rise. Not much jam tomorrow. They've got a corporation tax, a whopping corporation tax rise to foot in 2023. Some nice words about investment and investment allowances, and we'll get something on energy security next week. In many ways, for business, that is the more relevant document than this one today, because there's not a lot in it for business.
Right, and we'll be covering that, obviously. Thank you to all of you. That's been absolutely brilliant analysis there. That's it from this Politics Live special covering the Chancellor's spring statement. And, of course, I will be back tomorrow when we will have delved even more into these documents at 12:15. Bye-bye.